Close your eyes and let your mind drift back, far back through the corridors of time, to a place where the first stories were born. Picture yourself walking through moonlit ruins where ancient rivers still flow as they did 5,000 years ago, where the whisper of wind through broken stones carries echoes of humanity's oldest tale. Here, in the cradle of civilization, where writing itself was first carved into wet clay, scribes by flickering lamplight preserved a story that would outlive empires, outlast kingdoms, and speak across millennia to hearts like yours that still wonder about friendship, loss, and what it means to be human. Tonight, you are invited to journey alongside two souls whose bond transcended the boundaries between civilization and wilderness, between mortal and divine, between the fear of death and the courage to live fully. Their names were Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and their story, carved into tablets older than the pyramids, remains as fresh and vital today as when the first storyteller spoke it beneath desert stars. Let the weight of your daily concerns dissolve like morning mist as we step together into this ancient world, where the struggles and triumphs feel both wonderfully distant and surprisingly familiar. This is a story of transformation, of friendship that changes everything, and of wisdom found in the most unexpected places. 2. The Divine Birth of Kings, 1,800 words. In the time when the world was young and gods walked more freely among mortals, when the Euphrates River ran fuller, and the lands between it and the Tigris bloomed with abundance unknown to later ages, there arose a city that would become the mother of all cities. Uruk, they called it, and its walls rose from the fertile plain like a crown of baked brick and bitumen, its towers reaching toward heaven, as if mortals might touch the realm of the gods themselves. Within these walls, in a palace that gleamed with lapis lazuli and gold, was born a child destined to bridge the gap between human and divine. His mother was Ninsun, wise and beautiful, a goddess whose tears could heal wounds, and whose dreams revealed the future. His father was Lugal Banda, a mortal king whose courage in battle had earned him a place in legend. But the child who emerged from their union was something entirely new, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, a being who would carry within himself both the glory and the burden of existence that touched two worlds. They named him Gilgamesh, and from his first breath it was clear that he was unlike any child born before or since. His limbs grew strong with supernatural speed, his mind sharp with divine wisdom, his heart burning with ambitions that no mortal frame should contain. The priests who blessed his birth spoke in hushed tones of prophecies, how he would accomplish great deeds, how his name would echo through time, how he would learn truths that would humble even the gods. But prophecies, like morning shadows, reveal their full meaning only when the sun has traveled its complete arc across the sky. Imagine walking through the Uruk of his youth, your sandals clicking against stones worn smooth by countless feet, the air thick with the scent of incense from temple altars, and the sounds of a civilization learning to become itself. Here, in workshops that never slept, craftsmen hammered bronze into tools that would feed thousands, while in temple schools, young scribes learned to press their thoughts into clay, creating the very foundation of recorded history. The ziggurats rose like artificial mountains, their stepped sides painted in colors that caught the sun and threw it back transformed, blue like the depths of heaven, gold like the eyes of gods. This was the world into which Gilgamesh was born, but it was also the world he would inherit and transform. For kingship, in those ancient days, meant more than ruling over subjects and collecting tribute. A king was believed to be the earthly representative of divine order, the living bridge between the chaos that lurked at civilization's edges and the harmony that gods desired for their chosen people. When Gilgamesh came of age and took the throne, he carried with him not just the power to command armies and build monuments, but the sacred responsibility to maintain the balance between heaven and earth. Yet power, especially power touched by divinity, carries within it the seeds of both greatness and corruption. The very qualities that made Gilgamesh capable of extraordinary deeds, his supernatural strength, his divine insight, his will that could bend reality to his desires, also set him apart from those he was meant to serve. Picture him in those early days of his reign, towering above ordinary men, not just in physical stature, but in the scope of his abilities, able to defeat any warrior in combat, to solve problems that baffled his wisest counselors, to see through deceptions that fooled everyone else. But isolation, even the isolation that comes from being superior, breeds its own form of blindness. When you can have anything you desire simply by reaching for it, when no one can match your strength or challenge your will, when the very gods have granted you powers beyond mortal ken, it becomes all too easy to forget that those around you are not merely subjects to be commanded, but fellow souls deserving of respect and compassion. The palace where Gilgamesh held court was a marvel of ancient engineering. Its halls vast enough to hold hundreds, its walls decorated with scenes of royal hunts and divine favor, its gardens watered by clever systems of channels that brought the river's life-giving flow to every corner. Here he would sit upon a throne carved from a single block of cedar, his advisors arranged before him like petals around the center of a flower, listening to their reports of harvests and trade, of distant kingdoms and local disputes, of all the thousand details that keep a civilization running smoothly. But even as he fulfilled the duties of kingship with supernatural efficiency, even as Uruk prospered under his rule and its influence spread throughout the known world, something essential was missing. For all his divine heritage, for all his earthly power, Gilgamesh remained fundamentally alone. There was no one who could match his strength, no one who could challenge his ideas, no one who could stand as his equal in the grand game of existence. And loneliness, perhaps more than power itself, has the ability to warp even the noblest heart. The gods, watching from their celestial realm, saw what was happening to their chosen king and understood that his very perfection was becoming his greatest flaw. For how can one learn wisdom without facing opposition? How can one develop compassion without experiencing vulnerability? How can one grow into the fullness of what it means to be human, even human touched by divinity, without encountering another soul who can serve as both mirror and challenge? As years passed, and Gilgamesh's power consolidated into something as fixed and unchangeable as the movement of stars, the people of Uruk began to experience their king's greatness as a burden rather than a blessing. His strength, which could have been used to protect them, became a tool of oppression. His divine insight, which might have guided them toward justice, instead revealed to him exactly how to bend their wills to his desires. His royal prerogatives, granted by both gods and tradition, expanded until they consumed the very lives they were meant to shelter. Walk with me through the streets of Uruk in those darker days, and you would see a city that gleamed with prosperity but trembled with fear. The merchants in the marketplace conducted their business with downcast eyes, knowing that any display of wealth might attract the king's attention and result in confiscation. Fathers teaching their sons the family trade did so with heavy hearts, understanding that a boy who showed exceptional skill might be conscripted into royal service, never to return to his parents' modest home. In the workshops where bronze was hammered and pottery shaped, where cloth was woven and bread was baked, the rhythm of daily labor was punctuated by a tension that never fully lifted. But Gilgamesh's appetites knew no bounds, not for treasure, not for labor, not for the more intimate pleasures that power can command. When the king desired a new palace, every able-bodied man in the city might find himself dragging stones under the desert sun. When he wished to celebrate a festival, every household might be required to contribute their finest foods, leaving families to go hungry while the palace feasted. But perhaps most painful of all was the droit du seigneur. The king's claimed right to be the first to lie with every new bride on her wedding night. Picture, if you can bear it, the scene that played out again and again in those days. A young woman who had saved herself for marriage, dressed in her finest garments. Her family gathered around her with joy and blessing, only to have that joy turn to ash when the king's guards arrived to escort her to the palace. The groom could only stand helpless, his hands clenched into fists that dared not strike, his heart breaking with the knowledge that his protest would mean not just his own death, but likely the destruction of his entire family. The streets would echo with the sound of weeping on such nights. The bride's tears, her mother's lamentations, her husband's quiet sobs of rage and shame. And in the morning, when she was returned to her new home, everyone would pretend that nothing had changed, that the violation could be forgotten, that life could somehow continue as if their king had not taken what was most precious to them. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of this tyranny was not its cruelty, but its mindlessness. Gilgamesh did not set out to be a monster. He simply took what he wanted because he could, acted on his impulses because no one could stop him, indulged his appetites because his divine nature made them seem somehow justified. In his mind, shaped by godlike power and isolated by his uniqueness, the people of Uruk existed primarily to serve his desires. Their pain was real, but it was distant from him, filtered through the impossible gap between his semi-divine consciousness and their purely mortal understanding. The palace itself became a symbol of this disconnect, its golden halls filled with treasures taken from his subjects, its gardens watered with their sweat, its very stones mortared with their tears. Servants moved through its corridors like ghosts, their eyes carefully averted, their voices pitched to whispers, their every gesture calculated to avoid attracting attention that might prove fatal. Even his advisors, chosen for their wisdom and experience, learned to tell him only what he wanted to hear. For truth-telling had become a luxury that few could afford. But oppression, no matter how efficiently administered, creates its own pressures. In the homes of Uruk, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, people began to speak in carefully guarded whispers about their suffering. Mothers holding their daughters closer, fathers plotting impossible escapes, young men grinding their teeth in helpless fury. The very fabric of the community was stretching toward its breaking point. And in the temples, where priests still maintained their ancient duties despite their fear, the prayers began to change. No longer were they simply expressions of gratitude for harvest and prosperity. Instead, they became pleas for deliverance. Desperate appeals to the gods who had created this terrible king to somehow limit his power or teach him compassion. The incense that rose from temple altars carried with it not just the ritual fragrances of cedar and myrrh, but the concentrated essence of an entire people's longing for justice. Night after night, the prayers rose like smoke toward heaven. Day after day, the suffering continued, as if the gods had turned their faces away from the cries of their worshippers. But the divine realm operates according to different laws than the mortal world, and what seems like absence or indifference to human eyes may simply be the slow turning of celestial wheels too vast for mortal comprehension. For the gods had indeed heard the prayers of Uruk's people, and they were not unmoved by their suffering, but their response would come not in the form of lightning bolts or divine punishment, not in the dramatic interventions that human imagination might expect. Instead, it would manifest as something far more subtle and ultimately more powerful. The creation of a companion who could challenge Gilgamesh not through superior force, but through the irresistible power of equality and friendship. Far from the stone walls and bronze gates of Uruk, beyond the cultivated fields where farmers bent their backs to coax grain from reluctant earth, past the dusty trade routes where merchants drove their laden donkeys toward distant markets, there stretched a wilderness that remembered the world as it had been before. Cities rose and kings claimed dominion over the hearts of men. Here, in valleys where no plough had ever turned the soil, beside streams that ran clear and cold from mountain springs, among groves where every tree grew according to its own nature rather than human design, the gods shaped their answer to Gilgamesh's tyranny. They took clay from the riverbank, the same fundamental substance from which the first humans had been molded at the dawn of creation. But they worked it with special care, with divine attention to detail that exceeded even their original craftsmanship. Into this clay they breathed not just life, but a particular kind of life, wild, untamed, innocent of civilization's corruptions, yet possessed of a strength that could match even Gilgamesh's semi-divine power. They named their creation Enkidu, and when they were finished, they placed him gently in the wilderness to grow and learn according to nature's wisdom rather than human ambition. Imagine, if you can, what it would be like to experience consciousness for the first time, not in a city surrounded by walls and laws and expectations, but in a world where every sensation is pure and unfiltered, where every sight and sound and scent carries no meaning beyond its own immediate presence. Enkidu's first breath was not of incense-heavy air from temple courtyards, but of wind that had traveled across hundreds of miles of grassland, carrying with it the mingled fragrances of wild flowers, the musk of distant animals, the clean smell of rain-washed stones. His eyes opened not to walls decorated with scenes of conquest and royal glory, but to a sky so vast and blue it seemed to cup the entire world in its embrace. Clouds moved across that sky like slow ships sailing on invisible oceans, their shadows passing over hills and valleys in patterns that followed no human schedule, served no mortal purpose, answered only to the patient rhythms of weather and season, and the sun's eternal journey from horizon to horizon. As his limbs gained strength and coordination, as his senses learned to interpret the thousand signals that the wilderness provides to those who know how to read them, Enkidu discovered that he was not alone in this paradise. All around him moved creatures that accepted his presence without question or fear, gazelles that grazed peacefully while he sat among them, their dark eyes reflecting trust, so complete it had never occurred to them to feel otherwise. The water he drank came from springs that bubbled up from deep places in the earth, cold and sweet and utterly pure, unmarked by the taste of bronze pipes or ceramic vessels. The food he ate grew wild and free, fruits that ripened in their own time, nuts that fell when they were ready, roots that could be gathered with nothing more than patient searching and careful digging. His body, unclothed and unashamed, bore no marks of jewelry or ornamentation, but was decorated instead by the sun's golden touch and the intricate patterns of shadow that filtered through leaves overhead. Sleep came to him without effort, without the tossing and turning that plagues those whose minds are full of tomorrow's obligations and yesterday's regrets. When darkness fell, he would find a soft place among the roots of a great tree, or beside a pool where the water whispered gentle songs, and there he would rest as naturally as a bird settling on its nest, his dreams filled with nothing more complex than the sensation of wind on his skin and the distant sound of night animals going about their ancient business. Perhaps most remarkably, Enkidu lived without loneliness. Not because he was surrounded by creatures who could speak his thoughts back to him, for he had no language yet beyond the simple communications of gesture and expression, but because he felt himself to be part of something larger and more encompassing than any individual consciousness. He was woven into the great tapestry of natural existence, his heartbeat synchronized with rhythms that pulsed through everything, from the smallest insect to the mightiest cedar tree. Days flowed into one another without the artificial divisions that humans create to organize their experience. There was light and darkness, warmth and coolness. The coming and going of rains. The slow wheel of seasons bringing different fruits to ripeness and different flowers to bloom. But all of these changes felt like variations in a song, rather than separate and distinct events. Time itself seemed to move differently in this wilderness paradise, not with the urgent forward push of human ambition, but with the patient circularity of natural cycles. The animals he lived among were not just companions, but teachers. From the gazelles, he learned how to move with fluid grace, how to sense danger from the slightest change in the wind's direction, how to find water even in the driest season by reading the subtle signs that plants and insects provide to those who know their language. The lions taught him about strength that is used only when necessary, about the patience that waits for exactly the right moment to act, about the difference between power and violence. Even the smaller creatures had lessons to offer. The bees showed him the sweetness that could be found in the most unexpected places. The birds demonstrated the joy of movement, unconstrained by earthbound limitations. The fish in the streams revealed the grace of surrender, the way one could navigate even turbulent waters by yielding to forces greater than oneself, rather than fighting them. As months and seasons passed, Enkidu grew not just in physical strength, though his muscles became like iron beneath skin bronzed by constant exposure to sun and wind, but in a kind of wisdom that had nothing to do with books or formal learning. It was a wisdom of the body and the heart, an understanding that came from being fully integrated into the rhythms of the world as it existed before humans began their long project of reshaping it according to their desires. He could predict weather by the behavior of insects, find healing plants by following the guidance of animals that sought them out when they were sick, navigate by stars that told stories in languages older than words. His senses became so acute that he could hear the approach of strangers from miles away, could smell water or danger or the subtle changes that preceded storms, could feel in his bones the movements of herds even when they were far beyond the horizon. Yet for all his growing strength and awareness, for all the depth of his integration into the natural world, Enkidu remained innocent of the complex emotions that drive human behavior. He knew contentment and simple joy, brief flickers of alarm when predators approached, the satisfaction of hunger satisfied and thirst quenched. But he had never experienced jealousy or ambition, or the peculiar form of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by others yet feeling fundamentally misunderstood. This innocence was perhaps his greatest gift, and would prove to be his greatest vulnerability. But while it allowed him to live in perfect harmony with the wilderness that was his home, it left him unprepared for the complexities of human emotion and desire that would soon enter his world and transform it forever. In the city of Uruk, as Gilgamesh's tyranny continued to weigh upon his people, like a stone upon the chest of a sleeper, the suffering finally reached a point where even the most patient could bear it no longer. A hunter, one of those brave souls who ventured beyond the city's walls to track game in the wild places, came before the king with a tale that would set in motion events that neither he nor Gilgamesh could have foreseen. "My lord," the hunter said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. "There is a creature in the wilderness, a wild man who interferes with my work. He springs my traps, fills in my pits, and leads the animals away from my snares. My family grows hungry because of him, and I dare not venture too deep into his territory, for his strength appears to be more than human." Gilgamesh listened to this account with the casual interest of one accustomed to having all problems brought to his attention, but something in the hunter's description stirred a memory of dreams he had been having. After a moment's consideration, he gave his judgment. "Go to the temple of Ishtar," he commanded, "and ask for Shamhat, wisest of the sacred women. Take her to the wilderness, and let her use her arts to civilize this wild man. What cannot be conquered by force may yet be transformed by love." Shamhat was not merely a temple prostitute, as later, more prudish ages would describe her, but a priestess of the goddess of love and fertility, trained in mysteries that connected the physical expression of desire to the deepest spiritual truths. She was beautiful, certainly, with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths like still water and skin that glowed with health and confidence. But her true power lay in her understanding of the sacred nature of intimate connection between souls. When the hunter approached her with Gilgamesh's request, she listened with the grave attention that her calling demanded. This was not merely a task to be completed, but a sacred duty that would require all of her skill and wisdom. For she understood, perhaps better than Gilgamesh himself, that the wild man represented something precious and irreplaceable. The journey to the wilderness took 3 days, during which Shamhat prepared herself, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually, for the encounter to come. She had dealt with many men in her service to the goddess, from nervous youths experiencing their first taste of love to powerful kings seeking in her arms a momentary escape from the burdens of rule. But she sensed that this encounter would be different, more consequential, touched by divine purpose in ways that she could feel but not yet fully understand. When they reached the watering place where the hunter had seen the wild man, they concealed themselves and waited. The sun moved slowly across the sky, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow through the trees, while birds called to each other in languages that predated human speech, and insects hummed the eternal songs that connect all living things in their vast, invisible web of interdependence. Then, in the golden light of late afternoon, Enkidu appeared. Even at a distance, Shamhat could see that he was magnificent, tall and powerfully built, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his body and his environment. His hair fell in dark waves past his shoulders, and his skin bore the warm bronze of someone who had never known the shelter of walls or the restriction of clothing. But it was not his physical beauty that took her breath away. It was something more subtle and more profound, a quality of presence that spoke of wholeness, of integration, of a soul that had never been divided against itself. The animals that came to drink showed no fear of him. Indeed, they seemed to welcome his presence, gathering around him like children around a beloved parent. She watched as he touched a young gazelle with infinite gentleness, as he shared space at the water's edge with a pride of lions who accepted him as naturally as they accepted the trees and stones and sky. When the hunter whispered urgently that this was indeed the creature who had been disrupting his work, Shamhat silenced him with a gesture. This was a moment that required reverence, not hasty action. She was witnessing something that perhaps no civilized human had ever seen. A man who lived in perfect harmony with the natural world, untouched by the fears and desires and artificial needs that drove the behavior of those who dwelt in cities. But her duty was clear, And the goddess she served was not only the patron of love, but also the deity who presided over the transformation that love brings. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the clearing. Enkidu saw her immediately, his senses far too acute to miss the approach of strangers, but he showed no alarm. Instead, he regarded her with the frank curiosity of one who had never learned that there were things that should not be stared at, situations that called for embarrassment or shame. His gaze took in her human form, so different from the animals he knew, and his expression showed wonder rather than desire, interest rather than hunger. Shamhat approached slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful, speaking to him in the gentle tones she might use with a frightened animal. He did not understand her words, of course, but something in her manner, some quality of openness and invitation, drew him closer. When she extended her hand, he sniffed it as he might investigate any new and interesting scent. And when she began to remove her garments, he watched with the innocent fascination of one who had never learned to connect nudity with shame. What followed was not mere physical coupling, though their bodies did join with a passion that shook the earth beneath them and sent the animals fleeing to a respectful distance. Instead, it was a sacred ritual of transformation, a meeting of consciousness that awakened in Enkidu capacities that had lain dormant since his creation. Through 7 days and 7 nights, Shamhat served as his teacher and guide, showing him not just the pleasures of physical love, but the deeper mysteries of connection, communication, and shared consciousness. As their time together progressed, changes began to manifest in Enkidu that went far beyond the merely physical. His eyes, which had always been clear and direct, began to show the complex depths that come with self-awareness. His gestures became more nuanced, more expressive, as if he were learning an entirely new language of the body. Most remarkably, he began to speak, not the full, complex speech of those raised in civilization, but simple words and phrases that Shamhat taught him, building blocks of communication that would allow him to bridge the gap between his wild nature and the human world that awaited him. But transformation is never without cost, and as Enkidu's consciousness expanded to encompass new possibilities, he also began to experience loss. The animals that had once welcomed him without question now seemed wary of his presence. The scent of humanity that clung to him after his time with Shamhat marked him as something other than what he had been, and the creatures of the wilderness, operating on instincts refined over millions of years, recognized that he was no longer entirely one of them. When Shamhat judged that his transformation was complete enough for the next phase of his journey, she began to teach him the basics of civilized life. She showed him how to wear clothing, how to eat bread instead of raw plants, how to drink beer and wine instead of water from streams. Each lesson was another step away from his original nature, another small death of the wild man he had been, but also a birth into possibilities he could never have imagined. The transition from wild innocence to human consciousness is perhaps the most profound transformation that any soul can undergo. And for Enkidu, it came not as a gradual enlightenment, but as a sudden awakening that left him reeling between two worlds, no longer fully belonging to either, yet called to embrace both. Under Shamhat's patient guidance, he began to learn the intricate dance of civilization, how to speak in words rather than gestures, how to clothe his body against weather and shame, how to transform raw materials into the cooked foods that marked the boundary between animal and human existence. Picture him in those first days after his awakening, sitting beside a shepherd's fire as the sun set over the vast grasslands, his newly clothed body still awkward in its coverings, his hands fumbling with bread that tasted nothing like the wild fruits that had sustained him for so long. The wool of his garment felt strange against skin that had known only wind and sunlight, and the warmth of the fire created an artificial environment that his wild instincts found both comforting and disturbing. The shepherds who welcomed them were simple men, accustomed to the solitude of their calling, but generous in the way of those who understand the value of rare human contact. They shared their food without question, offered shelter without demand for payment, and watched with gentle amusement as this strange, wild man learned to navigate the basic elements of their civilized existence. To them, he was clearly touched by the gods in some way. His supernatural strength was evident in the casual way he could lift stones that would challenge 3 ordinary men, and his preternatural senses allowed him to detect approaching wolves long before their dogs caught the scent. But it was in learning to protect the flocks that Enkidu began to understand his first taste of human purpose, beyond mere survival. When wolves approached in the darkness, drawn by the scent of vulnerable sheep, he found himself positioned between the predators and their intended prey, not as a fellow wild creature, but as a guardian of civilization's gentle dependence. The wolves, recognizing something familiar in his scent, yet confused by his new allegiance, circled uncertainly before melting back into the night, leaving behind only the memory of gleaming eyes and the soft sound of padded feet on grass. This first act of protection awakened in Enkidu something that his wild existence had never required: a sense of responsibility for creatures weaker than himself, an understanding that strength could be used not just for personal survival, but for the welfare of others who depended on his protection. The shepherd's gratitude was simple and heartfelt, expressed in shared meals and warm acceptance, but it planted in his consciousness the seeds of what would become his driving passion: the desire to use his great strength in service of justice rather than mere dominance. As days passed, and his education in human ways continued, Enkidu began to hear stories that disturbed his newly awakened sense of right and wrong. The shepherds spoke in careful whispers of conditions in the great city of Uruk, of a king whose power knew no limits and whose appetites consumed the happiness of his people like a fire consuming dry grass. They told him of young men conscripted into endless labor, of fathers who could not protect their daughters from royal desires, of a civilization that had grown so complex and hierarchical that suffering had become systematized, built into the very structures that were supposed to provide protection and order. These stories awakened in Enkidu something that the wilderness had never taught him: moral outrage. In nature, strength dominated weakness according to patterns as old as creation itself, and there was no injustice in the lion taking the gazelle or the hawk seizing the rabbit. But this was different. This was strength being used, not for survival or natural order, but for pleasure and ego, for the satisfaction of appetites that had grown beyond any reasonable need or natural limit. His education in human foods proceeded alongside his awakening to human moral complexity. The bread that had at first tasted strange and artificial gradually became familiar, even pleasant, as his palate adapted to flavors created by human ingenuity rather than natural growth. Beer, that most civilized of beverages, transformed from bitter shock to warming comfort, and he learned to appreciate the way it loosened tongues and created bonds of fellowship around evening fires. But with each new taste, each new pleasure, he also moved further from his original nature, like a swimmer being carried by an invisible current away from the shore where he was born. Shamhat watched these changes with a mixture of pride and sorrow, understanding that her work was succeeding, perhaps too well. The wild man who had lived in perfect harmony with nature was disappearing, replaced by someone who could never again be fully content in either world. Too civilized now to return to his innocent paradise, yet too recently awakened to navigate human society without the guidance she could provide. When she judged that he was ready for the next phase of his transformation, she began to tell him more detailed stories about Uruk and its king. She described Gilgamesh's superhuman strength, his divine heritage, his accomplishments as a builder and conqueror. But she also spoke of his growing tyranny, his abuse of power, his casual cruelty toward those who could not resist his will. As she spoke, she watched Enkidu's face, seeing how each detail of injustice caused his features to tighten with anger, how his hands would clench into fists when she described particularly egregious examples of royal excess. "There is a king," she said one evening, as they sat beside a fire that painted dancing shadows on their faces, "who believes that his divine blood gives him the right to take whatever he desires, regardless of the cost to others. His strength is great, perhaps as great as yours, but he uses it to dominate rather than protect, to satisfy his own appetites rather than serve his people's needs." Enkidu listened with growing agitation, his newly awakened moral sense recoiling from the picture she painted. In the wilderness, strength had been balanced by natural law, limited by the requirements of survival, and the ancient patterns that kept all things in their proper places. But this was strength without limit, power without responsibility, desire without consequence, at least without consequence for the one who wielded such power. "Someone should challenge him," Enkidu said, his voice rough with emotion. "Someone should stand between him and those he oppresses, as I stood between the wolves and the sheep." Shamhat smiled, recognizing that her work was complete. The innocent wild man was gone, replaced by someone who understood both his own power and his moral obligation to use it justly. The transformation that had begun with physical awakening was now complete in the realm of consciousness and purpose. Enkidu had become fully human, not in the sense of losing his supernatural abilities, but in the deeper sense of accepting responsibility that went beyond his own immediate needs and desires. The journey to Uruk stretched ahead of them like a path toward destiny, and as they prepared to leave the peaceful world of shepherds and grasslands, both understood that they were walking toward a confrontation that would change not just their own lives, but the fate of the great city itself and all who dwelt within its walls. The great gates of Uruk rose before them like the entrance to another world, their bronze surfaces polished to mirror brightness, their height designed to humble any who approached the city with less than reverent intentions. Guards in leather armor and bronze helmets stood at attention, their spears catching the late afternoon sun, their eyes scanning the endless stream of merchants, farmers, and travelers who sought entry to the greatest city in the known world. But even among this constant flow of humanity, Enkidu's appearance caused a stir. His size alone would have drawn attention. He stood nearly a head taller than most men, his shoulders broad enough to carry burdens that would crush lesser frames. But it was something more subtle that made people step aside as he passed. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with the fluid grace of someone who had never learned to doubt his own physical capabilities. Or perhaps it was the quality of his gaze, direct and unflinching in a way that spoke of someone who had never learned to hide his thoughts behind the masks that civilization typically requires. Shamhat, walking beside him with the quiet dignity of her calling, served as both guide and interpreter as they made their way through streets that bustled with activity. Even as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the city was a revelation to Enkidu's newly awakened consciousness. Workshops where craftsmen hammered bronze into tools and weapons, markets where goods from across the known world were displayed in colorful profusion, temples where incense-heavy air carried the prayers of thousands toward the realm of the gods. The contrast with his simple wilderness existence was overwhelming yet fascinating. Here was human ingenuity made manifest in stone and brick and bronze, the collective effort of countless generations who had chosen to live together rather than separately, to specialize their labor rather than each providing for all their own needs, to create something larger and more complex than any individual could achieve alone. Yet beneath the surface magnificence, Enkidu's acute senses detected undercurrents of fear and resentment that spoke of the very problems Shamhat had described during their journey. As they moved deeper into the city, following streets that wound between buildings of increasing grandeur, the sounds of celebration began to reach their ears. Music flowed from open doorways, the high, sweet notes of flutes, the rhythmic beating of drums, the voices of singers raised in ancient melodies that spoke of joy and new beginnings. Shamhat explained that they were approaching a wedding feast, one of those precious moments when the city's inhabitants could forget their troubles and celebrate the hope that each new union represents. But as they drew closer to the source of the celebration, the music began to take on a strained quality, and the voices of the revelers carried undertones of forced gaiety that spoke of joy maintained in the face of impending sorrow. For word had spread through the gathering that the king himself intended to exercise his ancient privilege, to claim the bride for himself before she could properly belong to the man who had pledged to love and protect her for life. The wedding party had gathered in a small square, surrounded by modest but well-maintained houses, their walls decorated with garlands of flowers that filled the evening air with sweet fragrances. The bride sat in a place of honor, her face painted with ceremonial designs, her dress the finest that her family could afford, but her eyes held the hollow look of someone who was trying not to think about what the night would bring. The groom stood nearby, his jaw tight with suppressed anger, his hands clenched into fists that he dared not use, surrounded by male relatives whose faces showed the same mixture of rage and helplessness. As the celebration continued with increasingly desperate intensity, the sound of marching feet began to echo from the direction of the palace. The royal guard was approaching, their bronze armor clanking in rhythm with their measured steps, their spears held at the formal angle that proclaimed official business. At their head walked a herald whose job it was to make the king's will known to his subjects. His voice trained to carry authority even when delivering messages that broke hearts and destroyed dreams. By order of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, chosen of the gods and protector of the people, the herald proclaimed, his words falling into the sudden silence like stones into still water. Let the bride prepare herself to attend upon his majesty. The assembled wedding guests seemed to shrink into themselves, their earlier joy evaporating like morning mist before the sun. The bride's mother began to weep quietly, trying to muffle her sobs with the edge of her shawl, while the bride herself sat frozen, her face drained of all color, her hands trembling in her lap like captured birds. It was at this moment that Enkidu stepped forward. His movement was not hurried or dramatic, but it carried with it a quality of inevitability that drew every eye in the square. He walked with the same easy confidence he had shown when protecting the shepherd's flocks, his gaze fixed not on the herald or the guards, but on something beyond them. The principle of justice that had been awakened in his consciousness by his exposure to human civilization and its failures. "No," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square despite its quiet tone. "This will not happen." The herald, accustomed to having his proclamations received with resigned acceptance if not enthusiasm, stared at this unexpected challenge with a mixture of surprise and indignation. The guards, trained to respond to any threat to royal authority, began to move their spears into more aggressive positions, but something in Enkidu's bearing gave them pause. This was not the desperate defiance of a man driven beyond endurance. but the calm certainty of someone who had weighed the situation and found it wanting. "Stand aside," the herald commanded, his voice rising to project the authority of the throne he represented. "You interfere with the king's will at your peril." "The king's will is unjust," Enkidu replied, his words carrying across the square like a bell tolling. "And unjust will must be opposed by those who have the strength to oppose it." Word of the confrontation spread through the city with the speed that only shocking news can achieve. People emerged from their homes and workshops, drawn by rumors of someone who dared to challenge royal authority directly, openly, without the careful circumlocutions that usually marked any criticism of Gilgamesh's actions. They gathered at the edges of the square and on nearby rooftops, their faces showing a mixture of hope and terror as they witnessed something they had never expected to see. From the palace came the sound of running feet and angry voices as word reached Gilgamesh himself that his will was being defied. The king's response was immediate and decisive. He would go personally to deal with this challenger, not out of any sense of personal offense, but from genuine curiosity about someone who possessed the confidence to oppose him. For too long, he had ruled without encountering any meaningful resistance, and the prospect of facing a worthy opponent stirred something in his heart that he had almost forgotten: excitement. When Gilgamesh appeared in the square, striding through the gathered crowd with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his own superiority, the very air seemed to thicken with tension. He was magnificent in his royal regalia, his crown catching and reflecting the light of torches, his robes flowing behind him like liquid gold, his bearing proclaiming his divine heritage and earthly authority. But it was not his finery that made the crowd shrink back. It was the aura of barely contained power that surrounded him like heat from a forge. For a long moment, the two champions regarded each other across the small space that separated them, each taking the measure of the other, with eyes that recognized equality when they saw it. Gilgamesh saw in Enkidu someone who matched his own supernatural size and strength, whose confidence was born not of ignorance, but of genuine capability, whose moral certainty gave him a kind of authority that no crown could confer. Enkidu saw in Gilgamesh not the monster that the stories had led him to expect, but someone like himself, powerful, isolated, shaped by forces beyond ordinary human experience, yet somehow lost in the maze of his own capabilities. "You are the wild man," Gilgamesh said, his voice carrying a note of recognition. "I have dreamed of you. I have heard of you," Enkidu replied. "Your strength is great, but you use it to cause suffering rather than prevent it." "My strength is mine to use as I see fit," Gilgamesh answered, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was testing the idea as much as stating it. "I am king by divine right, chosen of the gods, answerable to no mortal authority." "Then let the gods judge between us," Enkidu said, and stepped forward to block the path that led toward the bride. What followed was not merely a physical contest between two supremely powerful beings, but a collision of worldviews, a clash between different understandings of what strength should be used for and what responsibilities come with great power. They came together like thunderclouds meeting in the sky, their initial impact sending shockwaves through the ground beneath their feet and causing the assembled crowd to stagger backward in awe and terror. Their battle raged through the streets of Uruk with supernatural intensity. Stone walls cracked under the pressure of their grappling bodies. Bronze gates buckled when they crashed against them, and the very foundations of buildings shook as they wrestled with a strength that belonged more to legends than to ordinary human experience. Yet, for all its violence, their combat had a quality of ritual about it, as if both combatants understood that they were engaged in something more significant than mere conflict, a test that would determine not just who was stronger, but who was right. As the night wore on and their battle continued, something began to change in the quality of their struggle. The initial fury that had driven them to test each other's limits gradually gave way to a growing recognition of equality, and with that recognition came something that neither had expected: respect. Each discovered in the other not an enemy to be destroyed, but a worthy opponent who could match his strength and mirror his capabilities. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky and both warriors stood breathing heavily in the ruins of what had once been a busy marketplace, they looked into each other's eyes and saw reflected there the same realization. They were equals, not just in strength, but in their fundamental isolation, their shared burden of being different from ordinary mortals, their need for someone who could understand the weight of supernatural capability and the loneliness that came with it. In that moment of recognition, enemies became brothers, opponents became companions, and the great friendship that would define both their lives was born in the midst of destruction and violence, forged in the fire of mutual respect and tempered by the recognition of shared destiny. In the days that followed their epic confrontation, something remarkable began to unfold in the great city of Uruk, a transformation so gradual yet so profound that its effects would ripple outward like circles in still water, touching every life within the city's walls and extending far beyond them into the wider world. The two champions who had met as adversaries found themselves drawn together by a bond deeper than friendship, stronger than brotherhood, more enduring than any alliance forged by treaty or mutual advantage. Gilgamesh, who had ruled for so long without encountering anyone who could match his strength or challenge his assumptions, discovered in Enkidu something he had never known he was missing. Not merely someone of comparable physical power, though that was remarkable enough, but a consciousness that could engage with his own thoughts and feelings without being overwhelmed or intimidated by their intensity. For the first time in his life, he could speak freely about his burdens and aspirations, his fears and ambitions, without having to moderate his words for a lesser understanding. Enkidu, in turn, found in Gilgamesh a guide who could help him navigate the complexities of civilized existence, while respecting the wild wisdom he had brought from his life in the wilderness. The king's sophisticated understanding of human nature, politics, and the intricate web of relationships that held a great city together complemented Enkidu's intuitive grasp of justice and his uncompromising moral clarity. Together, they formed a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts, each supplying what the other lacked. Walk with me through the palace in those early days of their friendship, and you would witness scenes that would have been impossible to imagine before their meeting. In the great hall where Gilgamesh held court, you might see the two of them engaged in deep conversation about matters of governance, Enkidu's questions challenging assumptions that had never been questioned, Gilgamesh's explanations revealing the hidden complexities that lay beneath seemingly simple decisions. Why, Enkidu might ask, watching as petitioners approached the throne with their various requests and complaints. Do you require such elaborate ceremonies before people can speak to you? In the wilderness, those who needed help could approach directly without protocol or formal dress. And Gilgamesh, forced to examine practices he had always taken for granted, might find himself explaining not just the practical necessities of maintaining order in a complex society, but the deeper psychological functions that ritual and ceremony served in creating shared meaning and social cohesion. Through such conversations, both men deepened their understanding. Enkidu learning to appreciate the delicate balance required to govern thousands of disparate individuals. Gilgamesh remembering that power existed to serve rather than to be served. The changes in Gilgamesh's behavior were subtle at first, noticed only by those who had served him most closely, but gradually they became apparent to the entire population of Uruk. The arbitrary demands for labor on vanity projects became less frequent, replaced by public works that served genuine needs. More significantly, the dreaded exercise of royal privilege over new brides simply stopped. No official proclamation announced this change. No herald explained the king's new policy. But as wedding followed wedding without royal interference, the people of Uruk began to dare to hope that their suffering under tyranny might finally be ending. Families could celebrate their children's marriages without the shadow of forced separation. Young men could court the women they loved without fear that royal desire might steal away their happiness. In the palace gardens, where carefully tended plants created an oasis of beauty within the urban environment, the two friends could often be found in quiet conversation as evening shadows lengthened and the heat of the day gave way to the coolness of approaching night. Enkidu would share stories of his life in the wilderness, encounters with great storms that reshaped the landscape overnight, observations of animal behavior that revealed patterns invisible to civilized eyes. Moments of profound peace when he had felt himself to be part of something infinitely larger than individual consciousness. Gilgamesh, in return, would speak of the burdens of kingship that he had never been able to share with anyone else. The weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, the loneliness of occupying a position that set him apart from all normal human relationships. Through these intimate exchanges, both men found healing for wounds they had carried so long they had almost forgotten they existed. The friendship between them was noticed not just by the people of Uruk, but by the gods themselves, who watched with interest as their great experiment in creating a companion for Gilgamesh bore fruit beyond their expectations. They had intended Enkidu to humble the arrogant king, to teach him the limits of his power and the importance of compassion. But the relationship that developed was richer and more complex than they had foreseen. Instead of simply moderating Gilgamesh's worst impulses, Enkidu's presence awakened in him capacities for growth and wisdom that had lain dormant since his youth. But friendship between two such extraordinary beings could not remain forever content with the quiet pleasures of mutual understanding and shared governance. Both men possessed not just supernatural strength, but supernatural ambitions, drives toward greatness that ordinary life, no matter how well ordered and peaceful, could not fully satisfy. As months passed and their bond deepened, a restlessness began to grow between them, a sense that their capabilities were meant for something larger than the administration of even the greatest city. Late at night, when the palace had grown quiet and they sat together in Gilgamesh's private chambers, their conversations began to turn toward possibilities that lay beyond Uruk's walls. They spoke of the great wilderness that stretched beyond the known world, of legendary creatures that were said to dwell in places so remote that few humans had ever returned from seeking them, of deeds that might win them immortal fame and prove their worth, not just to their contemporaries but to all future generations. Enkidu would describe the vast forests he had known in his wild days, groves of cedar trees so ancient and magnificent that they seemed to touch the very heavens, their silence so profound that even whispers carried for miles, their guardians so terrible that the bravest hunters turned back from their borders without attempting entry. Gilgamesh would listen with growing excitement, his divine blood responding to the call of adventure, his royal pride stirring at the thought of accomplishing something that no other mortal had ever achieved. "We could go there," he would say, his eyes bright with possibility. "Together, we could face whatever guardians protect those sacred groves. We could bring back cedar timber for the glory of Uruk and the honor of the gods. We could prove that even the mightiest barriers can be overcome by those who possess sufficient courage and determination." And Enkidu, despite his deep love for the peaceful life they had built together, despite his knowledge of the dangers that awaited any who challenged the ancient powers that protected the deep wilderness, found himself gradually won over by his friend's enthusiasm. For he too felt the pull of destiny, the sense that their meeting had been arranged by forces greater than themselves, for purposes that extended beyond personal happiness or civic responsibility. The decision, when it finally came, felt as inevitable as the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. They would undertake a quest together, a journey that would test not just their individual strengths, but the power of their bond, an adventure that would either cement their friendship in eternal glory or destroy them both in the attempt to achieve the impossible. As winter gave way to spring in the great city of Uruk, and the air filled with the scent of new growth and the promise of renewed life, Gilgamesh found himself increasingly consumed by a restlessness that no amount of administrative duty or quiet friendship could satisfy. The peaceful governance of his kingdom, which had once seemed like the natural expression of his divine heritage, now felt constraining, like armor that had once fit perfectly, but now pinched and restricted his movements as he grew beyond its limitations. Or, in the pre-dawn hours when sleep eluded him, and the palace lay wrapped in that profound silence that comes just before the world awakens, he would walk the corridors and chambers where his ancestors had ruled, past walls decorated with scenes of royal hunts and divine favor. But instead of feeling pride in these accumulated symbols of power and prosperity, he found himself wondering what legacy he would leave beyond the mere continuation of what others had built before him. It was during one of these restless wanderings that he found Enkidu in the palace gardens, sitting quietly beneath a pomegranate tree whose branches were heavy with blossoms that glowed pale in the starlight. His friend's presence was comforting, as it always was, but tonight even their easy companionship could not quiet the growing urgency that seemed to pulse through Gilgamesh's veins like a second heartbeat. "I have been thinking," Gilgamesh said, settling beside his friend on the stone bench that had been placed to take advantage of the garden's most beautiful vista, "about the stories you used to tell me of the great cedar forest and of Humbaba who guards it. Do you think such tales are merely legends? Or do they describe real places, real challenges that might still exist in the world?" Enkidu turned to study his friend's face in the dim light, recognizing in his expression the same quality of intense focus that had marked his own features when he first learned of injustice in the city, and felt compelled to act against it. "The cedar forest is real," he said quietly. "I have seen it from a distance during my wandering days, though I never dared approach its borders. The trees are more ancient than memory, more magnificent than any palace ever built by human hands. And Humbaba." He paused, his expression growing troubled. "Humbaba is also real, and more terrible than any story can convey. He is not merely a guardian, but a force of nature itself, created by the gods to protect the wilderness from those who would exploit or destroy it." "But surely," Gilgamesh pressed, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he had once used to bend others to his will, but now employed to win his friend's cooperation rather than compel it. "Surely two such as ourselves, working together, could overcome even such a guardian. Think of the glory we would win, the service we would perform for our people by bringing back cedar timber for the temples and palaces of Uruk. Think of the story that would be told of our friendship, how it enabled us to accomplish what no individual hero could achieve alone. Enkidu was quiet for a long moment, his memories carrying him back to his days in the deep wilderness, when he had occasionally caught glimpses of the cedar forest's outer edges and felt the oppressive weight of the presence that dwelt within its depths. "My friend," he said finally, "you speak of glory and timber and stories to be told, but I fear you do not fully understand what you propose. Umbaba is not like the human enemies you have defeated, not like the wild beasts that can be overcome by superior strength and skill. He is something older and more primal, connected to powers that existed before civilization, before humanity itself learned to shape bronze and build cities." But Gilgamesh's excitement was not to be dampened by warnings, no matter how well-intentioned. All the more reason why such a deed would bring eternal fame, he insisted. Anyone can defeat human enemies or hunt ordinary beasts, but to face a creature of legend, to challenge the very forces that separate the known world from the realm of myth, such an accomplishment would place our names among the immortals, ensure that our friendship is remembered long after the walls of Uruk have crumbled to dust. As the nights passed and their conversations continued, Gilgamesh's arguments began to work their subtle influence on Enkidu's reluctant heart. For despite his intimate knowledge of the dangers they would face, despite his deep contentment with the peaceful life they had built together in Uruk, he could not entirely resist the pull of destiny that seemed to be calling them toward this ultimate test of their bond. More than that, he began to understand that his friend's restlessness was not mere thrill-seeking or vainglorious ambition, but something deeper. A recognition that their extraordinary capabilities had been granted for purposes larger than personal happiness or civic administration. "If we are to attempt such a quest," Enkidu said one evening, his tone suggesting that he was finally beginning to accept the inevitable, "we cannot approach it lightly or without proper preparation. Umbaba's power is not merely physical but spiritual, connected to the very forces that maintain the balance between order and chaos in the world. We would need weapons blessed by the gods, provisions for a journey that might take many months, and most importantly, we would need the favor of heaven itself, for this adventure will surely attract the attention of divine powers." Gilgamesh's face lit with triumph and gratitude at his friend's words, but he was wise enough to recognize that Enkidu's consent came with conditions that must be scrupulously observed. "Then we shall prepare as no heroes have ever prepared before," he declared. "We shall commission the finest weapons that human skill can create, infused with divine power through the proper rituals. We shall gather provisions not just for our physical needs, but for the spiritual challenges we will face, and we shall seek the blessing of every god who might favor our enterprise, offering whatever sacrifices are necessary to ensure their support." The decision once made, the two friends threw themselves into preparations with the same intensity they brought to everything they undertook together. The royal workshops rang day and night, with the sound of hammers on bronze as the city's finest craftsmen labored to create weapons worthy of heroes who would challenge the guardians of legend. Axes with edges sharp enough to split the hardest stone, swords balanced with such perfection that they seemed to move of their own accord, shields decorated with protective symbols that had been blessed by priests of every temple in the city. Word of the king's planned adventure spread through Uruk like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from excitement to terror to desperate pleas that he reconsider such a dangerous undertaking. The elders of the city, those wise counselors who had served Gilgamesh's predecessors, and understood the delicate balance that kept their civilization stable and prosperous, came before him in formal session to express their concerns. "My lord," their spokesman said, his voice heavy with the weight of years and responsibility, "we understand your desire for great deeds and lasting fame. But consider what would become of Uruk if both you and Enkidu were lost in this venture. You have no heir to continue your dynasty, no designated successor who could maintain the peace and prosperity that your reformed rule has brought to our city. Would glory purchased at such a price truly serve the people you are sworn to protect?" But Gilgamesh, his mind now fully committed to the quest, answered with the confidence of one who had never known defeat and could not truly conceive of failure. "Honor the courage that attempts great deeds, rather than the caution that avoids all risk," he replied. "If we succeed, Uruk will be enriched beyond measure, its fame spread to the corners of the earth. And if we fail, well, then you will at least know that your king and his companion died as heroes, facing impossible odds for the sake of immortal glory." As the final preparations neared completion, as weapons were blessed and provisions gathered and farewells spoken to those who might never see the two heroes again, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu felt the weight of destiny settling upon their shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and shadow. They stood on the threshold of an adventure that would test everything they had become, individually and together. And though neither could foresee the full consequences of their choice, both understood that they were about to embark upon a journey that would change them forever. The great gates of Uruk opened before them like the mouth of time itself, revealing the ancient road that led westward into lands that grew progressively wilder and more mysterious with each day's journey. Behind them, the city's walls gleamed golden in the morning sun, its temples and palaces rising like a promise of civilization against the vast sky, while ahead stretched the unknown path that would test every aspect of their friendship and determination. Gilgamesh and Enkidu walked side by side, their newly forged weapons gleaming at their sides, their packs filled with provisions that represented the best of human craft and foresight. Yet for all their careful preparation, for all the blessings they had received from priests and the good wishes of their people, they carried with them an awareness that they were venturing beyond the borders of the known world into realms where different laws might apply and different powers hold sway. The first days of their journey took them through familiar territory, fertile fields where farmers bent to their eternal work of coaxing sustenance from the earth, small villages where children ran out to wave at the passing heroes, markets where merchants displayed goods gathered from across the civilized world. Here, they were still recognizably within the sphere of human order, where problems could be solved by negotiation or force, where the rules of civilized behavior provided reliable guidance for decision and action. But as they continued westward, following trade routes that grew progressively less traveled and more overgrown, the landscape began to change around them in ways both subtle and profound. The fields gave way to grasslands, where wild herbs released their fragrances under the pressure of their feet, where streams ran clearer and colder than any water channeled through city aqueducts, where the night sky revealed stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than those visible through the smoke and dust of urban life. Enkidu found himself caught between two forms of nostalgia as they traveled deeper into the wilderness. On one hand, the scents and sounds of the wild world awakened memories of his earlier existence, when he had lived in perfect harmony with natural rhythms and known no concerns beyond the immediate requirements of survival. The part of him that remained connected to that simpler time felt a deep contentment in returning to landscapes unmarked by human ambition or design. Yet he was no longer the innocent creature who had once run with gazelles and slept peacefully under open skies. His consciousness had been transformed by love, by friendship, by moral awakening, and he could not experience the wilderness now with the same uncomplicated joy he had known before. He was aware, as he had never been in his purely wild state, of the tensions between civilization and nature, of the cost that human progress extracted from the natural world, of his own complex position as someone who belonged fully to neither realm yet was called to bridge both. Gilgamesh, for his part, found the journey both exhilarating and unsettling in ways he had not anticipated. Accustomed to environments shaped by human will and purpose, where every stone had been placed with intention and every path led to predetermined destinations, he struggled at first to navigate landscapes that followed their own ancient logic rather than any plan comprehensible to civilized minds. Rivers meandered according to the contours of hills rather than the shortest distance between cities. Forests grew thick and tangled rather than in orderly groves, and the very air seemed to carry messages in languages he had never learned to interpret. Yet gradually, as days passed and his body adapted to the rhythms of constant travel, as his senses sharpened in response to environments that demanded greater alertness than palace corridors, he began to understand something of what Enkidu had tried to describe about the deep satisfaction of living in direct relationship with the natural world. There was a freedom in walking paths that led wherever they wished to go rather than wherever duty demanded, in sleeping when darkness fell rather than when courtly obligations permitted, in eating when hunger arose rather than at formal meal times determined by protocol and ceremony. Their conversations during the long days of walking and the peaceful hours of evening camps revealed new depths in their friendship, as each shared perspectives that their different backgrounds made possible. Enkidu would point out signs invisible to civilized eyes, the meaning of cloud formations, the significance of bird migrations, the stories told by animal tracks and broken branches. While Gilgamesh would interpret their journey in terms of epic tradition, comparing their adventure to legendary quests that had been sung by poets in royal halls. "Look there," Enkidu might say, indicating a grove of trees whose leaves rustled despite the absence of any perceptible wind. The forest spirits are aware of our presence. They are not hostile, but they are curious. We are something they have not encountered before. Civilized beings who travel with respect rather than conquest in their hearts. And Gilgamesh would respond with observations drawn from his broader understanding of human history and divine intention. Then perhaps our quest serves purposes beyond our own glory or even the practical needs of Uruk. Perhaps we are meant to demonstrate that civilization and wilderness need not be eternal enemies, that those who possess power can choose to exercise it with wisdom rather than mere dominance. As they traveled deeper into regions that few humans had ever explored, the landscape itself began to take on an increasingly otherworldly quality. The trees grew taller and more ancient, their trunks so massive that it would take dozens of men holding hands to encircle them, their branches interweaving overhead to create a canopy so thick that day and night blurred together in perpetual twilight. The very air seemed thicker here, charged with presence and power, as if every breath they took carried them deeper into a realm where ordinary physical laws might not apply. Strange sounds echoed through these primeval forests, not the familiar calls of birds and beasts they recognized, but more mysterious voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the earth beneath their feet, from the spaces between shadows where their eyes could not penetrate. Sometimes they would catch glimpses of movement at the edges of their vision, forms that vanished the moment they turned to look directly, leaving behind only the impression of watching eyes and ancient intelligence. Their dreams, too, began to change as they entered these elder lands. Both men found their sleep filled with visions that felt more real than waking experience. Images of vast guardians moving through forests older than memory, of powers that had shaped the world before humans learned to speak, of trials that awaited them in the heart of the sacred grove they sought. Sometimes they would wake to find that they had shared the same dream, as if the approaching confrontation was casting its shadow backward through time to influence their preparations. "Are you afraid?" Gilgamesh asked one evening as they sat beside their small fire, watching shadows dance between the massive tree trunks that surrounded their camp. Enkidu considered the question carefully before answering. "I am not afraid of death," he said finally. "I have lived as both wild beast and civilized man, and I understand that existence takes many forms, that consciousness might continue even if this particular body fails. But I am afraid of failing you, of proving unworthy of the trust you have placed in our friendship. And I am afraid..." He paused, struggling to put into words a concern that went deeper than personal safety or even personal honor. "I'm afraid that we may be about to destroy something precious and irreplaceable, something that the world needs, even if it does not recognize that need." Gilgamesh nodded slowly, understanding his friend's dilemma. "I share that fear," he admitted. "But consider this. Perhaps destruction is not our true purpose here. Perhaps we are meant to encounter Humbaba, not as conquerors, but as representatives of civilized humanity who seek understanding rather than mere victory." As they spoke, neither man could know that their words were being carried on night winds to the very creature they sought, that their approach was being monitored by senses far more acute than any human possessed, that the guardian of the cedar forest was even now preparing for a confrontation that would test not just their strength and courage, but their wisdom and their worthiness to represent the best aspirations of their kind. The cedar forest revealed itself to them gradually, like a secret whispered in stages, to those who proved themselves worthy of its mysteries. First came the scent, a fragrance so pure and overwhelming that it seemed to cleanse their very souls with each breath, carrying within it the accumulated wisdom of trees that had stood sentinel since the world was young. Then came the sound, or rather the absence of sound, for the forest possessed a silence so profound that their own heartbeats seemed to echo like thunder in the stillness. When they finally stood at the edge of the sacred grove, both heroes found themselves struck speechless by the magnitude of what lay before them. The cedars rose like living pillars supporting the very vault of heaven, their trunks so massive that 100 men could not have joined hands around their circumference, their height so great that their crowns disappeared into mists that might have been clouds or might have been something else entirely. The space between these ancient giants was filled with a green twilight that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time, where moments stretched like honey and thoughts moved with the slow inevitability of seasons. "We are not the first to come here," Enkidu whispered, his voice barely audible in the cathedral hush that surrounded them. At the base of the nearest cedar, they could see scattered remnants of those who had made this pilgrimage before them. Bronze weapons corroded beyond use, fragments of armor that spoke of long-forgotten kingdoms, bones that had been polished white by centuries of wind and weather. Gilgamesh nodded grimly, understanding that they looked upon the remains of heroes from ages past, warriors who had possessed strength and courage comparable to their own, yet had found those qualities insufficient for the trial that awaited them. The sight should have been discouraging, but instead it filled him with a fierce determination to succeed where others had failed, to prove that the bond between himself and Enkidu could overcome challenges that had defeated even the greatest individual champions. As they ventured deeper into the forest, following paths that seemed to shift and change when they were not looking directly at them. Both men became aware of a presence watching them from the shadows. It was not the simple awareness of being observed that any experienced hunter might feel, but something far more intense and personal, as if every step they took, every breath they drew, every thought that passed through their minds was being weighed and measured by an intelligence vast beyond human comprehension. The trees themselves seemed to participate in this scrutiny, their branches swaying without wind, their leaves rustling in patterns that almost resembled speech, their ancient heartwood creaking with sounds that might have been warnings or might have been something else entirely. Occasionally, they would catch glimpses of eyes in the darkness between trunks, not the familiar golden orbs of forest predators, but something older and more terrible, burning with a light that belonged neither to sun, nor moon, nor stars. "Humbaba knows we are here," Enkidu said, his hand moving instinctively to the weapon at his side. "He has known since we first entered his domain, perhaps since we first conceived of this quest. We walk not through an empty forest, but through the body of a living entity, and every step brings us closer to its heart." They pressed onward, their earlier conversations about glory and fame seeming suddenly trivial in the face of the overwhelming presence that surrounded them. This was not merely a test of strength or courage, they realized, but something far more fundamental, a confrontation between different ways of understanding existence itself, between the ordered complexity of civilization and the chaotic vitality of primal nature. When Humbaba finally revealed himself, it was not with the dramatic flourish that human imagination might have expected, but with the slow inevitability of sunrise or the changing of seasons. One moment they were walking through seemingly empty forest, and the next they found themselves in a clearing where something vast and terrible waited with the patience of mountains and the watchfulness of stars. The guardian of the cedar forest defied easy description, for he partook of both earth and air, both plant and animal, both matter and spirit, in ways that challenged the categories by which civilized minds typically organize their understanding. His form shifted like shadows cast by moving leaves, sometimes appearing almost human in outline, sometimes resembling the cedars he protected, sometimes becoming something so alien that their eyes could not process what they saw and their minds recoiled from the attempt. But his voice, when he spoke, was unmistakably real, deep as the roots of mountains, resonant as the sound of wind through vast spaces, carrying within it the accumulated authority of ages beyond counting. "So," Humbaba said, his words seeming to emerge from the forest itself rather than from any visible mouth, "the civilized ones have come at last to challenge the guardian of the wild places. I have watched your approach, little builders of walls and shapers of bronze, and I have listened to your debates about glory and timber and the fame that might survive your brief lives. Tell me now, face to face with the reality of what you seek to overcome, what gives you the right to disturb the peace of these ancient groves?" Gilgamesh stepped forward, his royal training asserting itself even in the face of powers that dwarfed earthly authority. "We come not as conquerors, but as representatives of humanity at its best," he said, his voice steady despite the supernatural dread that pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight. "Our people need cedar timber for their temples and palaces, it is true, but more than that, they need to know that the barriers between civilization and wilderness can be crossed with honor, that progress need not always come at the cost of destruction." Humbaba's laughter was like the sound of ancient trees falling in distant forests, terrible in its power, yet somehow tinged with something that might have been sadness. "Honor," he replied. "Progress. Pretty words from creatures who measure their lives in heartbeats and their empires in centuries." I have guarded these trees since before your ancestors learned to make fire, watched over their growth through ice ages and floods, protected them from threats far greater than your bronze weapons and mortal ambitions. What honor do you offer me in exchange for their destruction?" It was Enkidu who answered, his understanding of both wild and civilized ways giving him insight that pure human culture could not provide. "Not destruction," he said quietly, "but partnership. We ask not for all the cedars, but for enough to build temples where your wisdom might be honored alongside the gods of the city. We offer not conquest, but alliance, a bridge between the world of ordered growth and the realm of wild abundance." For a long moment, Humbaba was silent, his terrible gaze moving between the two heroes, as if reading their souls like scrolls written in languages they did not know they possessed. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect, though it remained as dangerous as an avalanche and as implacable as the turning of the earth. "You speak better than most who have stood in this place," he said finally, "but words are wind, and the forest knows only deeds. If you would take from this sacred grove, you must prove your worthiness, not through speech, but through trial. Face me in combat, and let the outcome determine whether humanity has evolved beyond its destructive childhood, or remains a species too dangerous to be trusted with the Earth's ancient treasures." Both heroes understood that they had reached the moment toward which their entire quest had been building. The test that would determine not just their own fate, but the future relationship between civilization and the wild powers that preceded it. Drawing their blessed weapons, they prepared to face a challenge that would require not just their individual strengths, but the full power of their partnership. The unique force that could only emerge when two souls united in perfect trust and mutual understanding. The battle that followed was unlike anything that mortal eyes had witnessed since the gods themselves had fought to establish the order of the world, a conflict that shook the very foundations of reality and sent tremors through realms both earthly and divine. Humbaba moved with the terrible grace of natural forces unleashed, now striking like lightning that splits ancient oaks, now flowing like avalanches that remake entire mountainsides, now standing immobile as stone, while chaos raged around him like a storm that could not touch his essential being. Against this primal fury, Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought not as separate warriors, but as two aspects of a single will. Their movements coordinated with the precision that only perfect trust can achieve. Where Gilgamesh's divine heritage granted him strength that could crack boulders with his bare hands, Enkidu's wild wisdom provided the insight to anticipate their opponent's movements, to read the subtle signs that preceded each devastating attack. Together, they created a force that was both civilized and natural, both ordered and free, both human and something more than human. The earth beneath their feet cracked and heaved as supernatural forces clashed with impacts that registered like earthquakes, sending ancient trees swaying and causing landslides in distant mountains. The very air seemed to burn with energies released by their combat, and creatures of the deep forest fled to the farthest reaches of the wilderness, instinctively understanding that they witnessed powers too great for any ordinary life to endure. Hour after hour the battle raged, neither side able to gain decisive advantage, until it seemed as if the conflict might continue forever, locked in a stalemate that would outlast the civilizations that had given it birth. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. Not because either Gilgamesh or Enkidu was individually stronger than their supernatural opponent, but because their partnership created possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. When Humbaba struck at Gilgamesh with force enough to shatter mountains, Enkidu was there to deflect the blow just enough to prevent fatal damage. When the Guardian's attention focused on Enkidu's wild unpredictability, Gilgamesh could strike with the disciplined precision of royal training. Most importantly, their bond allowed them to coordinate attacks that came from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing even Humbaba's vast awareness to divide its attention in ways that created momentary vulnerabilities. The decisive moment came when both heroes, recognizing an instant of opportunity with the intuitive timing that only perfect partnership can achieve, struck simultaneously at the Guardian's heart. Their blessed weapons, forged with divine favor and tempered by human craft, pierced the supernatural armor that had protected Humbaba since the dawn of creation. Humbaba's cry of pain and surprise echoed through the forest like the death song of mountains, causing every living thing within 100 miles to pause in terror and wonder. The great Guardian swayed like a cedar cut at its roots, his form flickering between the various shapes he had worn throughout their battle, before settling into something almost human, almost comprehensible to mortal understanding. Blood darker than midnight flowed from his wounds. But it was not the red tide of ordinary mortality. Instead, it seemed to contain within itself the essence of growing things, the concentrated life force of every plant that had ever grown in the sacred grove, every animal that had found shelter beneath its branches, every season that had passed in its eternal cycles. Where this strange blood touched the earth, flowers bloomed with impossible speed and beauty, as if the Guardian's pain was being transformed into new life even as he died. "You have won," Humbaba said, his voice now touched with something that might have been pride as well as regret. "Your strength proved equal to mine. Your partnership created power that even the gods did not foresee. But tell me, victors, do you understand what you have accomplished? Do you comprehend the full meaning of your triumph?" Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood before the dying Guardian, their weapons still ready, but their hearts already beginning to experience something unexpected. Not the pure joy of victory they had anticipated, but a complex mixture of triumph and loss, pride and regret that neither had prepared themselves to feel. "We have proven that humanity can face the ancient powers as equals," Gilgamesh said. But his voice lacked the certainty that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. "We have won the right to take cedar timber for our temples and palaces, to bring benefit to our people through our courage and determination." Humbaba's laughter was softer now, tinged with something that might have been affection for these strange mortals who had bested him through their unprecedented partnership. "Indeed, you have won that right," he agreed. "But consider the cost, champions of civilization. I was not merely a guardian, but a living connection between your world and powers older than memory. My death severs a link that has maintained balance for millennia. The cedar trees will give you their timber now, but who will speak for the wilderness when humanity's appetite grows beyond all reasonable bounds?" As if to emphasize his words, they could hear the sound of cracking timber echoing through the forest, as trees that had stood for thousands of years began to fall, their ancient strength suddenly vulnerable without the supernatural protection Humbaba had provided. The sight of these magnificent giants toppling filled both heroes with an unexpected anguish, a sense that their victory was costing the world something precious and irreplaceable. "There was no other way," Enkidu said, but his voice carried doubt rather than conviction. "Your protection of the forest was absolute, allowing no compromise, no sharing of its bounty with those who might use it wisely rather than wastefully." "Perhaps," Humbaba replied, his form growing more transparent as his life force flowed away into the earth around them. "Or perhaps the fault lies not in absolute protection, but in your inability to imagine solutions that honored both civilization's needs and the wilderness's integrity. But what is done, and my time of guardianship has ended. The forest is yours now, heroes, Use it well, for there will be no second chances, no return to the balance that has been broken this day." With those words, the last guardian of the cedar forest faded like morning mist before the sun, leaving behind only the memory of his presence and the overwhelming silence of a wilderness that had lost its protector. The great cedars continued to fall around them, their ancient timber now free for the taking. But each crash echoed in the hearts of the victors, like a funeral bell tolling for something they could not name, but somehow knew they would mourn forever. As they gathered the precious cedar wood that had been the ostensible goal of their quest, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu found themselves working in uncharacteristic silence, each lost in thoughts too complex for easy sharing. They had achieved what they set out to accomplish, had proven their strength and their friendship in the most demanding possible trial. But the taste of victory was unexpectedly bitter, tinged with questions that had no easy answers, and regrets that would follow them long after they returned to the familiar comforts of civilization. The journey home would give them time to process what they had experienced, to understand the full implications of their triumph, and to prepare for consequences they could not yet foresee. For in defeating Humbaba, they had not merely won cedar timber for Uruk's temples. They had announced to the divine realm that humanity was no longer content to accept the limits that the gods had established, that mortal beings could challenge and overcome even the ancient powers that had shaped the world since its creation. Such announcements, as they would soon discover, do not go unnoticed by those who rule from the celestial realm, and the attention of the gods is not always the blessing that mortals imagine it to be. The return journey to Uruk should have been a triumphant procession, the two heroes bearing cedar timber, whose sacred fragrance announced their victory to everyone they encountered along the dusty roads that led toward home. Word of their achievement had somehow preceded them, as news of great deeds always does, and at every village and way station, people gathered to catch a glimpse of the mortals who had dared to challenge the ancient guardian of the wilderness and lived to tell the tale. Yet for all the celebration that surrounded their homecoming, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu carried within themselves a growing sense of unease, as if their victory had set in motion forces beyond their understanding or control. The dreams that visited them during their journey home were troubled and strange, filled with images of divine councils convening in celestial halls, of gods whose faces showed expressions ranging from admiration to concern, to something far more dangerous than either. Upon their arrival in Uruk, the entire city turned out to welcome them with festivities that lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. The cedar timber was fashioned into magnificent doorways for the temples, their wood polished to reveal grain patterns that seemed to hold entire landscapes within their whorls and spirals. Poets composed songs, celebrating the friendship that had made such impossible deeds achievable, while priests offered sacrifices of gratitude to the gods who had granted their champions victory. But it was during these very celebrations that the consequences of their actions began to manifest in ways that none of the celebrants could have anticipated. For their defeat of Humbaba had indeed attracted divine attention, but not all of that attention was favorable. The goddess Ishtar, whose domain encompassed both love and war, both creation and destruction, had watched their quest with growing interest, and now saw in Gilgamesh something that aroused her desire. She appeared to him as he stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the festivities in the streets below, materializing from the evening air with the sudden presence that only divine beings can command. Her beauty was overwhelming, not merely physical perfection, though she possessed that in abundance, but something deeper and more compelling, a radiance that spoke to every desire and ambition that had ever stirred in human hearts. "Gilgamesh," she said, her voice like honey mixed with wine, sweet yet intoxicating. "Great king, magnificent hero, conqueror of the unconquerable. Your deeds have impressed even the celestial realm, and I find myself drawn to one who has proven himself worthy of divine favor. Come, be my consort, share my bed and my throne, and I will grant you riches beyond imagination, power that extends far beyond the borders of any earthly kingdom. Her offer was accompanied by visions that filled his mind with images of what such a union might bring. Fleets of ships laden with tribute from every corner of the world, armies that would follow his banner to the ends of the earth, palaces that would make his current dwelling seem like a modest cottage, immortal fame that would outlast the very stars in their courses. But Gilgamesh, perhaps made wise by his friendship with Enkidu, perhaps warned by instincts awakened during their confrontation with Humbaba, found himself responding to her offer. Not with the gratitude and excitement she clearly expected, but with a careful wariness that surprised even himself. "Great Ishtar," he replied, his voice respectful but firm, "your beauty is beyond mortal comprehension, and your offer honors me more than I can express. But tell me, goddess of love and desire, what has become of your previous consorts? What fate awaited those who shared your divine affections before my time?" The question seemed to catch Ishtar off guard, her perfect features showing a flicker of something that might have been annoyance or might have been something more dangerous. "You speak of ancient history," she said, her tone still sweet, but now carrying an undertone that wise mortals would have recognized as warning. "The past is past, and you are unique among mortals, proven by deeds that set you apart from all who came before." But Gilgamesh, his memory sharpened by royal education, and his wisdom deepened by recent experiences, pressed his point with the persistence that had characterized his approach to every challenge he had faced. "Tammuz, the shepherd god who was your beloved, did he not end up spending half of each year in the underworld, torn from the light and life he loved? Ishulanu, the gardener who tended your date palms, was he not transformed into a mole, condemned to burrow in darkness forever? Your love, beautiful goddess, seems to carry with it a price that even gods find difficult to pay." The transformation that overtook Ishtar at these words was terrible to behold. Her divine beauty became something fearsome, her radiance shifting from golden warmth to the cold fire of distant stars, her presence expanding until it seemed to fill not just the balcony, but the entire sky above Uruk. The very air around them began to crackle with barely contained power, and Gilgamesh felt his mortal flesh rebel against the overwhelming force of her unleashed divinity. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice now carrying the sound of storms that level forests and floods that wash away cities. "How dare you reject what gods would beg to receive? How dare you catalogue my past loves as if they were evidence against my favor rather than proof of its value? You will regret this insult, mortal king. Your pride will cost you more than you can imagine." With those words, she vanished from sight, but her threat lingered in the air like smoke from a cursed fire. Gilgamesh stood alone on the balcony, his hands trembling slightly from the encounter, understanding that he had made an enemy whose power far exceeded anything he had faced in the wilderness. Below him, the celebrations continued, the people of Uruk still rejoicing in their king's triumph, unaware that their city now stood in the shadow of divine wrath. When Enkidu found him there, an hour later, still staring at the spot where Ishtar had appeared, his friend took one look at his expression and understood that something significant had occurred. "What has happened?" he asked, his wild-born senses detecting the lingering traces of supernatural presence that clung to the air like perfume. Gilgamesh recounted the encounter in detail, and as he spoke, both men gradually came to understand that their greatest trial still lay ahead of them. Defeating Humbaba had been difficult and dangerous, But at least they had faced him on terms they could comprehend, in combat where strength and skill and partnership could determine the outcome. Divine wrath operated according to different laws, and Ishtar's revenge would likely take forms they could not anticipate or prepare for in any conventional sense. Their fears proved justified when, 3 days later, the earth began to shake with footsteps that belonged to no earthly creature. The bull of heaven, sent by Ishtar as her instrument of vengeance, descended upon Uruk with supernatural fury that made their battle with Humbaba seem like a children's game by comparison. This was not merely a powerful guardian protecting his domain, but a force of pure destruction whose only purpose was to inflict suffering and death upon the city that sheltered the mortal who had dared to spurn a goddess's love. The bull's breath withered crops in the fields, its hooves cracked the foundations of buildings, and its presence brought drought and pestilence that threatened to destroy everything Gilgamesh and Enkidu had worked to protect. Faced with this threat to their people, the two heroes had no choice but to confront this divine monster, knowing that success would only further antagonize the goddess who had created it, while failure would mean the destruction of everything they held dear. Their battle with the Bull of Heaven became the stuff of legend, a conflict that raged through the streets of Uruk with such intensity that the very walls shook and the ziggurats swayed like reeds in a hurricane. Working together with the perfect coordination they had developed during their friendship, they eventually managed to overcome even this supernatural adversary, with Enkidu seizing the bull by its horns, while Gilgamesh delivered the fatal blow. But victory came at a cost neither had anticipated. As the Bull of Heaven died, Enkidu, in a moment of triumph and defiance, tore off one of the creature's mighty thighs and hurled it at the spot where Ishtar watched their battle from the divine realm. An act of sacrilege that would have consequences far more terrible than any earthly triumph could justify. The god's judgment came not with thunderbolts or proclamations, but with the quiet inevitability of dawn following night, of seasons turning despite all mortal desire to hold them back. In the divine council that convened beyond the sight of mortal eyes, the assembled deities weighed the actions of Gilgamesh and Enkidu against the ancient laws that governed the relationship between heaven and earth, between divine prerogative and mortal ambition. Enlil, Lord of wind and storm, spoke for those who saw in the hero's deeds a dangerous precedent that threatened the very order of creation. They have killed Humbaba, guardian of the sacred cedar forest, he intoned, his voice carrying the authority of ages. They have slain the Bull of Heaven, my own creation, and shown disrespect to Ishtar herself. Such actions cannot go unpunished, lest other mortals come to believe they can challenge divine authority without consequence. But Shamash, god of the sun and patron of justice, rose to defend them. Their actions, while bold, were not born of mere arrogance, but of friendship and the desire to protect their people. Enkidu was created by our own design to be Gilgamesh's companion, and together they have accomplished deeds that bring honor to both mortal and divine realms. The debate continued through what mortals would measure as days, though time moved differently in the celestial sphere. Some gods argued for mercy, recognizing in the hero's partnership something rare and precious that should be preserved rather than punished. Others insisted that divine majesty required a response that would remind all mortals of their proper place in the cosmic order. Finally, Anu, father of the gods and ultimate authority in all disputes, pronounced the judgment that would satisfy the demands of justice while preserving something of what the defenders valued. Let one of them pay the price for both. Their deeds require consequence, but their bond has created something worthy of preservation. Enkidu, who was created by divine will, shall return to the realm from which he came, while Gilgamesh shall live to carry the memory of their friendship and the wisdom that loss can teach. The first sign of the gods' decision manifested as a strange weakness that began to affect Enkidu during the height of their celebration of victory over the Bull of Heaven. At first, it seemed like nothing more than exhaustion from their recent battles, the natural fatigue that follows great exertion. But as days passed, the weakness deepened into something more troubling, a lassitude that no amount of rest could remedy, a gradual fading that spoke of forces beyond any mortal healing. Gilgamesh watched his friends decline with growing alarm and desperate helplessness. This was not an enemy he could fight, not a challenge he could meet with strength or strategy, or any of the tools that had served them so well in their previous adventures. This was something that struck at the very essence of Enkidu's being, draining away the vitality that had made him such a formidable companion and beloved friend. The palace healers came with their herbs and incantations, their carefully preserved knowledge of the body's humors, and the mind's relationship to physical wellness. They examined Enkidu with the thoroughness that royal favor commanded, but their efforts produced no improvement, no understanding of what was happening to someone whose constitution had always seemed as robust as the wilderness that had shaped him. Priests arrived with offerings to various gods, seeking divine intervention for the mysterious illness that was claiming their king's dearest companion. They performed elaborate rituals, burned expensive incense, sacrificed valuable animals in hopes of attracting celestial attention and favor. But the ceremonies, for all their careful adherence to ancient protocols, seemed to have no effect on Enkidu's condition, beyond providing comfort to those who performed them. As his friend grew weaker, Gilgamesh's own behavior began to change in ways that alarmed everyone who served in the palace. The king, who had once approached every challenge with confident determination, now paced the corridors like a caged beast, his face haggard with sleeplessness, his eyes wild with a desperation that no amount of royal authority could satisfy. He abandoned his administrative duties, ignored petitions from his subjects, and spent every waking moment at Enkidu's bedside, as if his presence alone could hold back the forces that threatened to take away the person who had given his life meaning. "Tell me what to do," he pleaded with his friend during one of Enkidu's moments of clarity, when the fog of illness lifted enough for conversation. "There must be something, some quest I can undertake, some price I can pay, some bargain I can make with the gods or demons or whatever powers control these things. I cannot lose you. I will not accept it." Enkidu's response came in a voice grown thin, but still carrying the wisdom that had always been his greatest gift. "My brother," he said, using the term of endearment that had become natural between them. "Some things cannot be changed by strength or determination or royal will. I feel myself being drawn back to the earth from which I was formed, called to return what was borrowed for my brief time in this world. This is not defeat. It is completion." But Gilgamesh could not accept such philosophical resignation, not from the person whose friendship had taught him everything important he knew about what it meant to be human despite his divine heritage. "No," he said fiercely, "you are not some temporary loan from the earth. You are Enkidu, my friend, my brother, the other half of my soul. If the gods think they can simply reclaim you like a toy taken back from a child, they will learn otherwise." As Enkidu's condition continued to deteriorate, his dreams began to take on a quality that disturbed both men profoundly. He would wake from fitful sleep with accounts of visions that seemed to come from some realm beyond ordinary experience. Dark landscapes where the sun never shone, great halls filled with the shades of the dead, rivers that carried souls rather than water toward destinations unknown and unknowable. "I have seen the house where the dead dwell," he told Gilgamesh one night. his voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute conviction. It is a place of dust and shadows, where kings and commoners are equal in their powerlessness, where the food is clay and the drink is bitter water. I am being prepared for that journey, my friend. The dreams are showing me what awaits, so that I might not be completely lost when my time comes to walk that path. These visions of the afterlife terrified Gilgamesh in ways that no earthly danger ever had. The idea that death might not be simply an ending, but a continuation of existence in conditions of eternal misery, was almost too horrible to contemplate. Worse still was the thought that his beloved friend might be condemned to such a fate while he remained behind, protected by his divine heritage from the common destiny of mortals. In the final days of Enkidu's life, as his body grew so weak that he could barely speak above a whisper, the two friends shared conversations that would have been impossible between them at any earlier time. The approaching shadow of death stripped away all pretense and social convention, leaving only the raw truth of their mutual affection and the profound impact they had made on each other's lives. "You gave me humanity," Enkidu said during one of their last coherent conversations. "When Shamhat awakened me to consciousness, she began the process, but it was your friendship that completed it. You taught me what it means to care for someone more than yourself, to find joy in another's happiness, to discover that strength shared is multiplied rather than divided. And you gave me wisdom," Gilgamesh replied, his voice thick with emotions he had never learned to express in any other context. "You showed me that power without compassion is tyranny, that strength without moral purpose is meaningless, that even a king is only truly great when he serves something larger than his own desires. When the end came, it was peaceful. Not the violent conclusion that might have been expected for someone who had lived such an adventurous life, but a gentle, fading like sunset giving way to star-filled darkness." Enkidu simply closed his eyes one evening as they talked quietly together, and when morning came, he had passed into the realm that his dreams had prepared him to enter. Gilgamesh's response to his friend's death was immediate and terrible. For 7 days and 7 nights, he refused to accept what had happened, sitting beside the still form and insisting to anyone who would listen that Enkidu was merely sleeping, that he would wake if they were patient and maintained their vigil faithfully enough. Only when decay finally made denial impossible did he allow the funeral preparations to begin, and even then, he participated in them with the mechanical movements of someone whose spirit had been shattered beyond any easy repair. The grief that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced, not the clean anger that could be satisfied by action, not the focused sorrow that came from specific losses, but a vast emptiness that seemed to expand until it threatened to consume everything that had once given his life meaning and purpose. In losing Enkidu, he had lost not just a friend, but a way of understanding himself, a mirror that had reflected back the best possibilities of what he might become. The funeral of Enkidu was a ceremony that brought all of Uruk to a standstill. A massive outpouring of grief, not just for the wild man who had become their champion, but for the profound change they could see overtaking their king. Gilgamesh spared no expense in honoring his fallen friend. The tomb was carved from the finest stone, decorated with scenes from their adventures together, filled with treasures that would have purchased entire kingdoms in the hope that somehow these material offerings might ease Enkidu's journey in whatever realm awaited the dead. Yet, for all the magnificence of the ceremony, for all the careful attention to ritual and tradition, Gilgamesh himself seemed to barely participate in the proceedings. He moved through the elaborate funeral rites like a man walking in his sleep, performing the required actions, but clearly absent in spirit. his mind and heart focused on realities that the gathered mourners could not share or understand. When the ceremony was complete and the great stone sealed Enkidu's tomb, when the priests had spoken their final words and the crowds had dispersed to their homes, Gilgamesh remained in the burial chamber, unwilling to take the step that would separate him from the last physical connection to his beloved friend. The palace guards who had been sent to escort him home found him sitting in perfect stillness beside the sarcophagus, his eyes fixed on the carved stone lid as if he could see through it to the face of the one who lay within. "My lord," they said respectfully, understanding that they addressed not just their king, but a man whose grief had taken him beyond the reach of ordinary comfort or counsel. "The people need to see you, know that their king continues to care for their welfare even in this time of great sorrow." But Gilgamesh seemed not to hear them, or if he heard, the words carried no meaning that could penetrate the wall of loss that surrounded him like armor made from his own tears. He continued to sit in the darkness of the tomb, his royal robes gradually becoming dusty and disheveled, his face growing gaunt from lack of food and sleep, his entire being focused on the impossible task of somehow calling back what death had claimed. It was only when the physical demands of his mortal flesh finally overwhelmed his will to remain that he allowed himself to be led from the burial chamber. But even then, his departure felt temporary, as if he were merely stepping outside for a moment before returning to resume his vigil. The palace that had once been the center of his world now felt like an elaborate prison, every familiar sight and sound serving only to remind him of shared experiences that could never be repeated. In the days that followed, those who served Gilgamesh watched in growing alarm as their king seemed to waste away before their eyes. He refused the ceremonial garments that marked his royal status, preferring instead the simple animal skins that reminded him of Enkidu's wild origins. He abandoned the carefully prepared foods that had once graced the royal table, eating only the plainest fare when hunger forced him to eat at all. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to have lost all interest in the duties of kingship that had once commanded his passionate attention. Petitioners who came seeking royal judgment were turned away by servants who explained that the king was indisposed, though everyone understood that this was merely a polite fiction to cover a reality too disturbing to acknowledge directly. The administrative machinery of the kingdom continued to function through the efforts of loyal officials who made decisions in their sovereign's name. But everyone understood that this situation could not continue indefinitely without serious consequences. It was during this period of profound withdrawal that Gilgamesh began to experience something that terrified him even more than the loss of his friend: a growing awareness of his own mortality. Enkidu's death had forced him to confront a truth that his semi-divine nature had allowed him to avoid for most of his life: that death was not merely something that happened to other people, but a destiny that awaited every conscious being, including himself. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, sending him into paroxysms of fear and desperation that made his grief over Enkidu's death seem almost manageable by comparison. If death could claim someone as strong and vital as his beloved friend, if the gods could simply decide to end a life regardless of the value that life held for those who loved it, then his own existence. "I too must die," he whispered to himself in the darkest hours of the night when sleep eluded him and the weight of realization pressed down upon him like a stone upon his chest. All my strength, all my divine heritage, all my accomplishments, none of it matters if death can take me as easily as it took Enkidu. I will end up in that house of dust and shadows he described, eating clay and drinking bitter water for all eternity. This recognition of his own mortality transformed his grief into something even more desperate: a frantic quest for some means of escaping the fate that had claimed his friend. If death was truly universal, if even the strongest and most beloved were subject to its final authority, then his only hope lay in finding some way to transcend the normal limitations of mortal existence, to achieve the immortality that his divine blood suggested might be possible. The stories came back to him then, legends he had heard in childhood about figures from the distant past who had somehow achieved eternal life. Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood that had once cleansed the world of its accumulated sins, was said to dwell still at the edge of existence, having been granted immortality by the gods as reward for his faithfulness during that ancient catastrophe. If such stories were true, if Utnapishtim still lived somewhere beyond the borders of the known world, then perhaps he possessed knowledge that could help another seeker escape the common fate of humanity. The decision, when it finally crystallized in Gilgamesh's mind, came with the same sudden clarity that had marked all the great turning points of his life. He would leave Uruk, abandon his throne and his responsibilities, and seek out the legendary flood survivor in whatever distant realm he might dwell. This was not a quest for glory or adventure, as his journey to the Cedar Forest had been, but a desperate flight from the one enemy he had never before been forced to face: the inevitability of his own death. When he announced his intention to the palace officials and priests who had been trying unsuccessfully to draw him back into his royal duties, their reaction was one of horror and dismay. The kingdom needed its king, they argued. The people depended on his leadership and protection. Such a journey was not only dangerous, but essentially selfish, abandoning his responsibilities for the sake of personal concerns that all mortals must eventually face. But Gilgamesh was beyond the reach of such arguments, driven by a desperation that made ordinary considerations of duty and responsibility seem trivial by comparison. What good is a king who will die, he demanded. What value does leadership have if it is only temporary? If I can find the secrets of eternal life, I can serve Uruk forever, protect my people for all time, ensure that their welfare never again depends on the uncertain succession of mortal rulers. With that justification, which convinced no one, least of all himself, Gilgamesh began preparations for a journey that would take him farther from home than he had ever traveled, into realms where the normal rules of existence might not apply, where the boundaries between life and death, between mortal and divine, between possible and impossible, might prove more fluid than they appeared in the familiar world of everyday experience. The transformation that overtook Gilgamesh as he prepared for his solitary quest was visible to everyone who encountered him during those final days in Uruk. The magnificent king who had once ruled with divine authority and supernatural confidence was gradually disappearing, replaced by someone who seemed to belong more to the ranks of desperate pilgrims and wandering beggars than to the lineage of gods and heroes. His royal robes were packed away in favor of rough garments suitable for hard travel. His carefully groomed appearance gave way to the wild hair and unkempt beard of someone who had ceased to care about the impression he made on others. The palace that had been his home since birth now felt like a tomb, every corridor and chamber filled with memories of conversations shared with Enkidu, every familiar sight serving as a reminder of the friend who would never again walk beside him through these familiar spaces. The very walls seemed to echo with ghost voices, and the gardens where they had spent so many peaceful evenings now felt haunted by the absence of the one person who had made them feel like home rather than merely a setting for royal display. When the time came for departure, Gilgamesh left without ceremony or fanfare, slipping away in the pre-dawn darkness like a thief fleeing from his own palace. There were no formal goodbyes, no royal proclamations about the purpose of his journey. No arrangements for governance in his absence beyond the hastily drafted documents that transferred temporary authority to his most trusted advisors. He simply walked through the great gates of Uruk, carrying nothing but basic supplies and the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast world beyond his kingdom's borders, he might find answers to questions that had driven him beyond the reach of reason. The road that led away from civilization was one he had traveled twice before, first with Enkidu on their journey to the Cedar forest, then returning in triumph with the sacred timber that had seemed like such a precious prize at the time. Now, walking alone over ground that had once echoed with the sound of their shared laughter and conversation, he felt the full weight of solitude in ways that his royal upbringing had never prepared him to experience. Every step took him farther from the world, where his identity had meaning, where his name commanded respect and his word carried the force of law. As days passed and familiar landmarks disappeared behind him, Gilgamesh found himself entering regions he had never seen before, landscapes that grew progressively stranger and more challenging with each mile of his journey. The well-maintained roads that served the major trade routes gradually gave way to rough paths that seemed barely used, then to game trails that wound through increasingly wild terrain, and finally to trackless wilderness, where his only guides were the stars overhead and an inner certainty that his destination lay somewhere beyond the known world's farthest borders. The physical hardships of solo travel began to take their toll on a body that had always been served by others, that had never been required to endure prolonged deprivation or navigate completely unfamiliar territory without support. His hands, accustomed to wielding weapons and royal scepters, grew calloused from climbing rocky slopes and clearing path through thorn bushes. His feet, shod in the finest leather that royal craftsmen could provide, still developed blisters and cuts from walking over terrain that seemed actively hostile to human passage. But far worse than the physical discomforts were the psychological challenges of complete isolation. Gilgamesh had never in his life been truly alone. Even in his most private moments, servants had been nearby, and for the years of his friendship with Enkidu, he had grown accustomed to sharing every significant experience with someone who understood him completely. Now, surrounded by empty landscapes that stretched to the horizon in every direction, he found himself confronting the full weight of his own thoughts without the buffer of companionship or the distraction of royal duties. The silence was the hardest thing to bear, not the peaceful quiet of the palace gardens in the evening, when silence had been a comfortable backdrop to intimate conversation, but the vast, indifferent silence of places where human voices had never been heard, where his words seemed to disappear into emptiness without even an echo to acknowledge their existence. He found himself speaking aloud, simply to hear the sound of his own voice, carrying on one-sided conversations with Enkidu's memory, addressing questions to the empty air that no living person could answer. As his journey continued through landscapes that grew progressively more otherworldly, he began to encounter phenomena that challenged his understanding of reality itself. Mountain passes that seemed to lead upward forever, climbing toward peaks that disappeared into clouds that never moved or changed. Valleys filled with mist that reflected his own image back at him from every surface, creating the illusion of being surrounded by infinite versions of himself, all walking the same desperate path toward the same impossible goal. In one particularly disturbing region, he found himself walking through what appeared to be a vast graveyard, filled with monuments to heroes and kings from ages past, whose names had been forgotten by living memory. The inscriptions on their tombs spoke of great deeds and eternal fame, of accomplishments that had once seemed as significant as his own. But time had worn away most of the carved letters, leaving behind only fragments of boastful claims that now seemed pathetically hollow. Here lies one who conquered nations. He could make out on one partially eroded stone. His name shall be remembered forever, proclaimed another monument whose base was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The sight filled him with a despair so profound that he had to force himself to continue walking, to resist the urge to simply lie down among these forgotten heroes and wait for death to claim him, as it had claimed them. It was in this region of ancient tombs that he encountered the first of the supernatural guardians who would test his resolve and determination. The scorpion men who blocked the mountain pass were creatures of legend, beings whose lower bodies were those of giant scorpions, while their torsos and heads maintained the roughly human form. Their eyes glowed with the same terrible light that had burned in Humbaba's gaze, and their voices carried the authority of those who had been charged with protecting the boundaries between different realms of existence. "Turn back, mortal king," they commanded as he approached the narrow defile that led through their mountain domain. "The path you seek to travel is not meant for living beings. What lies beyond our guard is reserved for those who have already passed through death's gate, and no amount of determination or royal blood can change that fundamental law." But Gilgamesh, driven by grief and desperation that had carried him far beyond the reach of ordinary caution, refused to be deterred by warnings that might once have given him pause. "I seek Utnapishtim, the far distant one," he declared, his voice carrying an authority born not of royal rank but of absolute need. "My friend has died, and I have learned that I too must face the same fate unless I can find the secret of eternal life. Stand aside, or I will force passage through your guard, regardless of the cost." The scorpion men studied him with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, that had watched countless heroes pass through their domain in search of impossible goals. Something in his manner, some quality of desperate sincerity that distinguished him from ordinary seekers after glory or treasure, seemed to move them to an unexpected compassion. "Your grief is genuine," their leader finally acknowledged, "and your love for your lost friend burns with a light visible even to our ancient eyes. We will not bar your passage, though we warn you that the path ahead holds trials that will test every aspect of your being. Many who have entered that tunnel of absolute darkness have never emerged, and those who do emerge are often changed beyond recognition by what they have experienced." With that warning, they stood aside and allowed him to enter the mountain pass that would take him deeper into realms where the normal laws of existence began to break down, where the journey toward impossible goals required not just physical endurance, but a willingness to confront the fundamental nature of reality itself. At the edge of the world, where the familiar laws of earth and sky began to dissolve into something altogether more mysterious, Gilgamesh found himself standing on the shore of waters that reflected no light from sun or moon or stars, yet somehow maintained a luminescence of their own that seemed to emanate from depths beyond measurement. The air here tasted different, not the salt tang of ordinary seas, but something older and more complex, as if these waters held dissolved within them the essence of every story ever told, every dream ever dreamed, every hope ever cherished and lost. Across this supernatural ocean, barely visible through mists that shifted between silver and gold and colors for which no earthly names existed, rose what could only be described as an island, though it seemed to hover slightly above the water's surface rather than resting upon it. Even from a distance, Gilgamesh could sense that this was no ordinary place, but somewhere that existed outside the normal flow of time and consequence, where the usual boundaries between memory and experience, between past and present, might not apply. Why? The boat that would carry him across those impossible waters appeared as if summoned by his need rather than discovered through any search on his part. Its hull was carved from wood that seemed to contain within its grain the patterns of entire forests, while its sail shimmered with the same otherworldly luminescence as the waters themselves. At its helm stood a figure whose age was impossible to determine. He might have been a young man, marked by experiences beyond his years, or an ancient being whose essence remained untouched by the passage of time. "I am Urshanabi," the ferryman said, his voice carrying the sound of distant waters over stone, "and I have been expecting you, Gilgamesh of Uruk. Your grief echoes across the realms like thunder, and your desperate quest has drawn the attention of powers that usually concern themselves with matters far removed from mortal affairs. The journey across those waters passed in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. The boat moving according to laws of motion that had nothing to do with wind or current or any force that Gilgamesh could understand. Conversations seemed to happen without words being spoken. Memories arose that belonged to neither passenger nor ferryman, but to the waters themselves, and the very act of crossing transformed the traveler in ways too subtle to notice, but too profound to ignore. When they finally reached the far shore, Gilgamesh found himself walking on ground that felt solid beneath his feet, yet somehow remained insubstantial, as if the island existed more as idea than as physical place. The vegetation that grew here was familiar yet strange, trees that resembled cedars, but whose needles caught and held light like jewels, flowers that seemed to bloom with their own inner radiance, grass that whispered with voices too quiet to understand, but too insistent to ignore. The dwelling where Utnapishtim awaited him was neither palace nor hut, but something that partook of both and neither, its walls seeming to be built from crystallized time itself, its roof open to skies that showed stars from ages past and future simultaneously. The man who emerged to greet him appeared at first glance to be simply an elderly mortal, his hair white with accumulated years, his face marked by the kind of deep lines that come from witnessing events too profound for easy forgetting. But his eyes revealed the truth of what he had become. They held depths that spoke of having seen the world destroyed and renewed, of having watched civilizations rise and fall like waves upon a shore, of possessing knowledge that mortal minds were not designed to contain yet, somehow managing to bear that burden with a serenity that Gilgamesh found both admirable and maddening. "Welcome, King of Uruk," Utnapishtim said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries but maintaining a warmth that spoke of understanding rather than judgment. "I have watched your approach through my dreams and visions, seen the path of grief and desperation that has brought you to this place beyond the world's edge. You seek the secret of eternal life, believing that if you can escape death's reach, you can somehow undo the loss that has shattered your heart." Gilgamesh felt his carefully prepared speeches, his royal demands, and logical arguments crumble in the face of this gentle acknowledgement of his true motivation. "You understand, then," he said, his voice smaller than he had intended, stripped of the commanding authority that had once characterized all his communications. "You know what it means to lose someone whose presence made existence itself meaningful. Surely someone who has himself escaped death's dominion can help another achieve the same transcendence." The smile that crossed Utnapishtim's ancient features was tinged with a sadness so profound it seemed to encompass all the sorrows the world had ever known. "Oh, my desperate friend," he replied, settling himself on a bench carved from what appeared to be crystallized moonlight. "How little you understand about the nature of what you seek. I have not escaped death. I have simply been set apart from it for reasons that have nothing to do with my own desires or accomplishments. What followed was the telling of a story that Gilgamesh had heard before in fragments and legends, but never with the terrible immediacy that came from the lips of one who had lived through every detail. Utnapishtim spoke of the great flood that had once cleansed the world of its accumulated wickedness, of the divine warning that had allowed him and his family to build the great boat that preserved life through that cosmic catastrophe, of the rainbow covenant that had promised such destruction would never again be visited upon the earth. The gods granted me immortality, he explained, his voice growing heavy with the weight of unwanted gift, not as reward for virtue or accomplishment, but as a living reminder of their own capacity for both wrath and mercy. I am a symbol rather than a person, a monument to divine power rather than a hero who achieved something through his own efforts. My eternal life is not a blessing, but a burden, separation from the natural cycles that give meaning to mortal existence. Gilgamesh listened with growing disbelief and frustration, unable to accept that someone who possessed what he most desperately wanted could speak of it as anything other than the ultimate prize. But surely, he insisted, surely the knowledge and wisdom you have accumulated over centuries of existence, the opportunity to love and create and experience beauty without the shadow of ending hanging over everything. Surely these make immortality worthwhile, regardless of how it was obtained. The look that Utnapishtim turned upon him then contained such depths of loneliness and regret that Gilgamesh felt his arguments die before they could be fully formed. You speak of love, the Immortal One said quietly, but what is love without loss? What meaning does affection have when it faces no threat of separation? I have watched everyone I ever cared about age and die while I remained unchanged. I have seen civilizations rise and flourish and crumble to dust while I endure, always the observer, never the participant. You think death is the enemy, but death is what makes life precious, what gives weight and significance to every choice, every moment, every connection between souls. But Gilgamesh's desperation was too great to be dismissed by philosophical arguments, no matter how profound. Then, teach me how it was done, he demanded, his voice taking on some of its old royal authority. Show me the secret. Let me decide for myself whether the price is worth paying. My friend is dead, and I cannot bear the thought of joining him in that house of dust and shadows. There must be another way. Utnapishtim studied him for a long moment, his ancient eyes seeming to peer into depths of the king's soul that Gilgamesh himself had never explored. Very well, he said finally, but first you must prove that you possess the fundamental qualities that immortality would require. If you cannot master sleep, how can you hope to master death? Stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights, and I will consider sharing what I know. The challenge seemed simple enough to someone who had faced supernatural guardians and overcome legendary monsters, but Gilgamesh discovered almost immediately that this trial was different in nature from any test of strength or courage he had previously encountered. This was a confrontation with the basic limitations of mortal flesh, with needs so fundamental that even divine heritage could not completely transcend them. Within hours, his eyelids grew heavy with a fatigue that seemed to seep upward from the very ground on which he sat. The island's otherworldly atmosphere, which had initially seemed stimulating and energizing, now revealed itself to be profoundly soporific, as if the air itself was designed to lull visitors into the deep sleep that would demonstrate their essential mortality. By the end of the first day, Gilgamesh was struggling to keep his eyes open, his head nodding despite his desperate efforts to remain alert. By the third day, he was experiencing hallucinations born of exhaustion, seeing Enkidu walking among Utnapishtim's strange trees, hearing his friend's voice calling to him from across the luminescent waters that surrounded the island. The temptation to close his eyes, just for a moment, just to rest them briefly before continuing his vigil, became almost overwhelming. On the seventh day, despite his heroic efforts and royal determination, despite his desperate need to prove himself worthy of immortality, Gilgamesh finally succumbed to the sleep that his mortal nature demanded. He woke to find 7 loaves of bread arranged beside him, each in a different stage of decay, marking the passage of time that his unconscious mind had been unable to track. "You see," Utnapishtim said gently as Gilgamesh stared at the evidence of his failure, "you are bound by the same limitations as all mortals. Sleep claims you as inevitably as death will claim you. The immortality you seek is not a prize to be won through effort or determination, but a condition that must be granted by powers beyond your control or mine." As Gilgamesh prepared to leave the island of Utnapishtim, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his quest had ended in failure, that the immortality he sought remained as elusive as ever. The ancient flood survivor's wife approached him with the quiet grace of one who had learned compassion through long ages of observing mortal suffering. Her face, like her husband's, bore the marks of time that had passed differently for her than for ordinary mortals. But her eyes held a gentleness that spoke of understanding rather than the distant wisdom that sometimes made Utnapishtim seem more monument than man. "Husband," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had shared in divine favor yet retained connection to human feeling. "This king has traveled farther than any mortal should be asked to travel, has endured trials that would have broken lesser spirits, has demonstrated a love for his lost friend that honors the very bonds that make existence meaningful. Surely such devotion deserves some acknowledgement, some small gift that might ease his return to the world of ordinary mortality." Utnapishtim regarded his wife with the fond attention of one who had learned over countless years to trust her judgment in matters of the heart, even when his own ancient wisdom counseled otherwise. After a long moment of consideration, he nodded slowly, as if reaching a decision that went against his better judgment, but accorded with deeper principles of mercy and compassion. "Very well," he said, turning to address Gilgamesh directly. "Though I cannot grant you the immortality you seek, though the gods have reserved that gift for circumstances that will never again arise in the world's history, there is something else, a secret known only to those who have lived beyond the normal span of years. At the bottom of the ocean, in the deepest places where sunlight has never penetrated, grows a plant that can restore youth to those who consume it. It cannot prevent death, but it can turn back the ravages of age, grant new vitality to bodies worn down by the weight of years." The description that followed filled Gilgamesh's imagination with images of hope renewed, of possibilities that he had thought forever lost. The plant, Utnapishtim explained, resembled a rose in its general form, but its thorns were sharper than any earthly flower possessed, and its roots extended so deep into the ocean floor that retrieving it would require not just courage, but a willingness to risk drowning in the attempt. "Its name in the old tongue," the Immortal One continued, "translates roughly as, 'the old man becomes young again,' and its power is not legend but fact. I have seen it work, though always at great cost to those who seek it. The plant does not give itself willingly to any hand, and the ocean that guards it is not the familiar sea you have sailed in your earthly life, but something older and more dangerous, filled with currents that can drag the strongest swimmer to depths from which no return is possible." Despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, Gilgamesh felt his heart kindle with the first genuine hope he had experienced since Enkidu's death. If he could not achieve true immortality, if he could not escape the fundamental fact of mortality that had terrified him since his friend's passing, at least he might find a way to extend his life, to postpone the dreaded journey to the house of dust and shadows for enough years to accomplish something meaningful with the time remaining to him. The diving itself was a trial that tested every aspect of his supernatural constitution. The waters that surrounded Utnapishtim's island, which had seemed luminous and beautiful from the surface, revealed themselves to be filled with pressures and currents that belonged to no earthly ocean. As he descended toward the plant that grew in the uttermost depths, his lungs burned with the need for air, his eyes strained to penetrate darkness that seemed absolute. His hands groped through waters so cold they seemed to leach the very life from his flesh. When he finally located the plant, growing alone in a small grove of coral formations that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, he understood immediately why Utnapishtim had warned him about its nature. The thorns that covered its stem were not merely sharp, but seemed to be alive, reaching toward his approaching hands with the aggressive hunger of predators sensing prey. The pain when he grasped it was beyond anything he had experienced in his battles with supernatural opponents. Not just physical agony, but something deeper, as if the plant was testing his worthiness by subjecting him to every sorrow, every loss, every moment of despair he had ever endured. But his determination, forged in the fire of grief and tempered by his long journey toward this moment, proved stronger than the plant's protective defenses. He held on despite the pain, despite the thorns that drew blood that clouded the water around him, despite the growing burn in his lungs that told him he had stayed underwater longer than any mortal constitution should have been able to endure. When he finally tore the plant free from its ancient resting place, it came away with a sound like the earth itself, sighing, and he began his desperate ascent toward the surface and the air his body craved. Breaking through into sunlight and breathable atmosphere felt like being reborn, like emerging from death itself into a second chance at life. In his hands, the plant seemed to pulse with vitality that echoed his own heartbeat, and he could almost feel the years that it might grant him, the extended time in which he might somehow find a way to honor Enkidu's memory and make peace with his own eventual mortality. The journey home began with excitement and hope that he had not felt since the early days of his friendship with Enkidu. Utnapishtim's warnings about the plant's potency had included specific instructions about its use. It should be prepared carefully, mixed with other herbs that would moderate its power, consumed only after proper purification rituals that would prepare the body to receive its transformative energies. But Gilgamesh planned to take it first to Uruk to share its benefits with the elderly citizens of his kingdom, to demonstrate his love for his people by granting them the gift of renewed youth before partaking of it himself. This plan filled his days with a sense of purpose that had been absent since Enkidu's death. He would return to his kingdom, not as a broken man fleeing from grief, but as a king bearing gifts that would transform the lives of his subjects. The old would become young again, the tired would be filled with new energy, and death itself, while not defeated, would at least be forced to wait, while an entire generation experienced the joy of renewed vitality. But the gods, it seemed, had other plans for both Gilgamesh and his precious plant. The theft occurred while he was bathing in a cool pool during the heat of the day, having traveled since dawn through desert lands that demanded frequent rest and refreshment. He had placed the plant carefully on the bank, wrapped in cloth that would protect it from damage, while he cleansed himself of the dust and sweat of hard travel. The serpent that emerged from the pool's depths moved with the fluid grace of something that belonged entirely to the water, its scales gleaming with colors that shifted like oil on water, its eyes holding an intelligence that spoke of ages spent in patient, waiting for exactly this opportunity. Before Gilgamesh could react, before he could even cry out in protest, the creature had seized the plant in its jaws and disappeared back into the depths from which it had emerged. In that moment, watching the ripples spread across the pool's surface like the echo of his own shattered hopes, Gilgamesh felt the last of his illusions about his ability to control his destiny drain away like water through sand. The plant was gone, his chance at extended youth vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and he was left once again with nothing but his grief and the terrible knowledge of his own mortality. Yet, as he sat beside the pool, staring at the spot where the serpent had vanished, something unexpected began to take shape in his consciousness. Not resignation exactly, but a different kind of understanding, a recognition that his desperate quest to escape the human condition had perhaps been the wrong goal from the beginning. The snake, he realized, would shed its skin and emerge renewed, but it would still be a snake, still bound by its essential nature, still subject to the cycles of life and death that governed all existence. Perhaps, he thought, as he resumed his journey toward home, the secret was not to escape the human condition, but to embrace it, to find meaning and purpose within the boundaries of mortality, rather than in the impossible dream of transcending them altogether. The city of Uruk appeared on the horizon like a memory made manifest in stone and bronze, its familiar walls rising from the desert plain with the same majestic confidence that had characterized them when Gilgamesh first departed on his desperate quest for immortality. Yet, as he approached the gates where guards had once snapped to attention at his approach, where citizens had once gathered to welcome their returning king with celebration and ceremony, he found himself seeing his kingdom with eyes transformed by loss, by failure, and ultimately by a hard-won wisdom that had cost him everything he thought he wanted in order to grant him something he had never known he needed. The guards at the gates initially failed to recognize the dusty, travel-worn figure who approached on foot, carrying nothing but a simple pack and the weight of experiences that had aged him in ways that no mere passage of time could account for. When recognition finally dawned, their expressions showed not joy, but a complex mixture of relief, concern, and uncertainty about how to greet a sovereign who had abandoned his throne to pursue impossible dreams in distant lands. "My lord," their captain said, his voice carefully neutral, neither accusatory nor celebratory, "the city has waited for your return. Your advisors have maintained order in your absence, but there have been questions about the kingdom's future, concerns about succession, diplomatic complications that require royal attention." Gilgamesh nodded, understanding that his sudden departure had created problems that would require careful attention to resolve, but finding that these concerns, which would once have commanded his immediate and passionate focus, now seemed somehow less urgent than they had before his journey. The kingdom had survived without him, had continued to function under the guidance of capable administrators, had proved more resilient than his ego had previously allowed him to believe. "I will attend to these matters," he said quietly, "but first I would walk through the city alone, see how my people fare, observe what has changed and what has remained constant during my absence." The streets of Uruk revealed a community that had indeed continued to thrive during his absence, but also one that bore subtle marks of his transformed kingship from the years before his quest. The arbitrary cruelties that had characterized his early reign were nowhere in evidence. Young couples walked hand in hand without fear of royal interference in their happiness. Merchants conducted their business with the confidence that came from just laws, fairly enforced. Children played in streets that felt safe and welcoming rather than oppressive. In the markets, He overheard conversations that spoke of the changes his friendship with Enkidu had brought to the kingdom, how the wild man's influence had helped transform their king from a tyrant into a ruler who genuinely cared for his people's welfare. These discussions were conducted in tones of gratitude and nostalgia, but also with an undercurrent of sadness for the friend whose death had sent their king into the wilderness in search of impossible solutions to universal problems. He was never the same after Enkidu died, he heard one elderly woman tell her companion as they selected vegetables from a merchant's stall. You could see the grief eating at him like a disease, making him desperate for something that no mortal was ever meant to possess. I hope his journey has brought him peace, but I fear he may have been chasing shadows that can never be caught. Her words struck him with unexpected force, not because they revealed anything he had not already come to understand about himself, but because they demonstrated how clearly his subjects had perceived the futility of his quest while he remained blind to it. Their wisdom, born not of supernatural experience, but of simple human understanding of life's fundamental nature, had shown them truths that all his divine heritage and heroic accomplishments had not been able to teach him. As he continued his solitary walk through the city, visiting the temples where cedar timber from his first great quest had been transformed into doorways of legendary beauty, observing the public works that his reformed rule had made possible, listening to the sounds of a prosperous and peaceful community going about its daily business, Gilgamesh began to understand something that his desperate flight from mortality had prevented him from seeing. The immortality he had sought in distant lands already existed, not in the form of personal survival beyond death's reach, but in the continuity of the community he served, in the improvements he had made to his people's lives, in the example of friendship and partnership that his bond with Enkidu had provided to future generations. His name would indeed survive his death, not carved on monuments to personal glory, but embedded in the better laws he had established, the kinder customs he had instituted, the memory of a king who had learned to put his people's welfare above his own desires. The palace, when he finally entered it, felt both familiar and strange. Still his home, still the center of his power and responsibility, but somehow smaller than it had seemed before his journey, less imposing, more clearly revealed as a human creation designed to serve human needs rather than as a divine dwelling that set him apart from those he ruled. The throne room where he had once held court with semi-divine authority now struck him as simply a well-designed space for conducting the practical business of governance. His advisors, when they gathered to brief him on the kingdom's affairs during his absence, were surprised by the changes in his manner and priorities. The king, who had once demanded immediate attention to matters involving his personal prestige, now listened patiently to reports about crop yields and trade agreements, about the welfare of widows and orphans, about the practical details that affected the daily lives of ordinary citizens. When he spoke, it was not with the commanding authority that had once characterized his pronouncements, but with a thoughtful consideration that weighed the impact of decisions on all who would be affected by them. "The kingdom has prospered in your absence, my lord," his chief advisor reported, "but your return brings stability that temporary arrangements cannot provide. There are diplomatic marriages to be considered, alliances to be renewed, ceremonial obligations that require royal participation. The people need to see that their king has returned, not just in body, but in spirit, committed to their welfare for whatever years remain to him." The phrase, "whatever years remain to him," would once have filled Gilgamesh with the terror that had driven him to challenge death itself. But now, those words landed with a quiet solemnity. He no longer feared the brevity of life, not because he had found a way to extend it, but because he had finally come to understand its worth. He looked around the room, not at the golden walls, or the ornate carvings of his victories, but at the faces of the men and women who had kept his kingdom whole. His advisors, yes, but also servants lingering in doorways, scribes at the edge of the chamber, guards standing silently by the columns. These people, each one mortal, each one limited by time, were the true measure of his reign. And it was through them, through their stories, their lives, their memory of his rule, that he would endure. "I will not seek immortality again," Gilgamesh said, his voice low but steady. Not in secret journeys, not in the impossible bargains of gods and sorcerers. If I am to live on, let it be in how I serve you now, in justice, in peace, in wisdom, in wisdom. There was a long silence. Then, one of the younger advisors, a man who had come of age during the king's absence, stood and bowed. "Then Uruk is blessed, my lord," he said, "for few kings return wiser than when they left." In the weeks that followed, Gilgamesh resumed his duties, but with a presence that was calmer, quieter, more deliberate. He no longer demanded songs of praise in the public square, nor ordered monuments built in his name. Instead, he walked among his people, listened to their grievances, mediated their disputes, and funded schools, temples, and libraries. He insisted that laws be written in simple language so that all could understand them. He paid special attention to orphaned children and to the poor, recalling with aching clarity how Enkidu had once spoken for those who could not speak for themselves. And each evening, after his duties were done, he walked to the city walls. There, overlooking the Euphrates, he would sit alone and watch the sunset stain the sky with gold and crimson. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to the gods, but to Enkidu. "You were the part of me that knew how to love without fear," he would whisper. "You showed me how to be human before I ever knew what it meant." Ki no longer asked for Enkidu's return. Ki no longer begged the heavens for secrets. He simply remembered, and in remembering, honored his friend in the only way that mattered, by living the lessons he had taught. Years passed. Gilgamesh aged. His hair grew white, his back bowed slightly, and his steps became slower, but his mind remained sharp, and his presence, even in old age, commanded quiet respect. The people of Uruk came to call him the Builder King, not for his physical monuments, but for the human foundations he laid in law, fairness, and humility. When finally he died, it was not in some distant land, or in the shadow of gods, but in his own bed, in the palace that had once seemed too vast for any mortal to fill. He died surrounded by his people, advisors, servants, and citizens alike, who held his hand and sang old songs of his journeys. And when he was gone, they wept not just for the king they had lost, but for the man he had become. They carved no statue in his likeness. Instead, they inscribed his story in clay tablets. Every word, every failure, every triumph, every question he had asked of life. And those tablets would survive longer than stone or bone, passed down through centuries, until the tale of Gilgamesh was read in distant lands by people who had never seen Uruk, but who recognized in his story their own longing, their own fears, their own search for meaning. Through story, Gilgamesh became what he had once foolishly sought through gods, eternal, but not because he defied death, because he embraced life.